it's time to sit down, keep it real, and cut the bullshit. Welcome to Table Talk. All right, guys, we're back with another episode of Table Talk. Today, my guests are Dr. Jen Case and Dr. Derek Wilcox. These credentials are long, so I'm going to just give the highlights because we're going to kind of walk down the road on how they were all accumulated. So with Dr. Jen, there's a PhD in human nutrition and performance, a registered dietitian, board certified specialist in sports dietetics. I'm going to have you go into that one a little bit because out of all those, that's probably the most intensive, if I'm not mistaken. Yes. Correct? Yes. If you've been following the Table Talk podcast, you know that element is a staple in most strength athlete and coaches' repertoire when working with the athletes or as they're preparing for whatever endeavor they're preparing for. I personally use it every day. My favorite flavor is the grapefruit, which I'll mix in water during my training, post-training, or basically throughout the whole day. I'll also use half a pack on my oatmeal in the morning. And if I don't put it in my oatmeal, then I'll put half a pack in my coffee. There's a variety of different chocolate flavors that come into the chocolate pack. I'm using it throughout the entire day. I'm not front loading it before my training. And I find that it completely eliminates the brain fog, which I just had, so maybe I should have had my element. Table Talk listeners can receive a free sample pack with any order. To go to www.drinkelement.com/tabletalk. That again is www.drinkelement.com/tabletalk. Element also offers a no questions asked refund policy. So if you don't like it for any reason, give it to a salty friend and they'll give you a complete 100% money back.
I'm Dan Paschalk. I'm the owner of Madtown Fitness in Madison, Wisconsin. As I progressed in powerlifting, I decided to open a gym. Did it right after I graduated college, and I was always searching around for good equipment. I was kind of stuck to the used market just because I couldn't afford new stuff, but I was always trying to pick up elite stuff. The last few years, as the gym's grown, I've finally gotten to that point where I could make that person that I called was Matt here at elitefts. We replace all of our free weights with elite stuff. We've got the combo racks, amazing stainless steel uprights, all these really awesome custom features. You know, not only does the elite stuff look awesome, but it really increased the durability of the equipment that we have in the gym, and just kind of like the functionality and the ease of use. It's stuff that can really hold up to heavy use. It's designed for powerlifters and for heavy lifting, but at the same time, it's stuff that the general fitness type of population can also use. It's really been a game changer for us. It's just been an awesome kind of renovation of our whole space, and it's like a whole new gym. So for the gym owners out there looking to make an awesome change within your facility, make sure you go to elitefts.com, pull up kind of the sales tab. You can send an email through there and ask for Matt. Otherwise, you can even call their customer service line and make sure they connect you to him. Matt will make sure that you get completely taken care of.
Visit SleepMe/TableTalk to get your chili pad and save up to $315 with the code TableTalk. This offer is available exclusively for Table Talk listeners and only for a limited time. Order it today with free shipping and try it out for 30 days. You can return it for free if you don't like it with their sleep trial. Visit www.sleep.me/tabletalk. Because you're not investing in better sleep, you're creating a better life. www.sleep.me/tabletalk. And certified strength and conditioning coach, as far as BJJ, right?
Yes.
There's 11-time world champion, 3-time pan champion, 2-time masters champion, internationals champion, and then there's MMA. I can just keep going. Anyway, I'm listing these things out because both of you guys have the education and experience, which is when we start talking about bro science and stuff like that. That's where those debates start, happen, as you're well aware of. But people aren't aware that there's people that have both. And that's kind of why you guys are out here. Now with Derek, backgrounds in powerlifting with an elite total in 4 different weight classes, a pro total in the 181s, 198, and 220s, all-time world record of 935 and 181. The lightest person at the time to squat a grand, and that was at 181. Is that correct?
Weighed in 194 for that.
194. Best lifts, 1050, 560, 725. And then here's where the education comes in. A PhD in sport, I can't say this word, physiology, yeah. And performance. I've always had an issue saying that, even though I took a class in that. And Class A Highland Games athlete as well. So what was interesting when I was going through all your guys' content and listening to past podcasts is, like myself, all your education was driven by your competitive endeavors.
Absolutely.
100%.
So I want to get into that a little bit. So when you started when you were like 15, right?
As far as competing,
weight training in general.
12.
12. Yeah. So 12. And then it was for football.
Well, originally it was just to try and get a pump before I got on the school bus for the girls to look at, but
didn't know that one.
Oh yeah. I think I've only mentioned that once because it's not my,
it's out there now.
It's out there now. Yeah. But yeah, it was originally, I started like really serious weight training, full body instead of just, getting the pump, when I was 14. Right before high school started, because that's when our sports program started it for us.
Mm-hmm.
So going into football, things like that, quickly figured out that even though, I'm not very tall and I was very light then, the heaviest I got in high school was 150, 155, thereabout. And I was also very slow. So I started to show a little bit of talent in lifting, and that's kind of where it took off. I just enjoyed that part of it a lot more.
What led to the decision of your college degree being in exercise science, I believe, right?
The first one I did, undergrad was actually, I finished with religious studies.
Religious studies, okay.
But I did
that one that wasn't out there. So, so when you went to college, what were your aspirations?
I wanted to be a strength coach.
With religious studies?
Nope. That was going to be my minor.
Okay.
But it was a really big moment in my life when I became really disillusioned with what the strength conditioning world was. I saw a lot of examples because I was on the exercise science track. I went through all the classes eventually, but as I was doing like internships and being around different programs, and I don't want to name names, but I quickly figured out that there were coaches that were getting paid lots of money that were some of the dumbest people I'd ever seen in weight rooms. And I just kind of gave up on it. I was like, this is obviously not what I thought it was. It doesn't have anything to do with what you know or how good you are at this job. It's who you know. And network's important in everything, but it was to the level of being a detriment and a risk to the athletes. And ethically, I couldn't be a part of it. So I was going to figure out a different route one way or another. So I took my credits in religious studies and eventually finished that degree. But I eventually found the grad program that I went to. And that grad program was exactly designed for the problems that I saw in my undergrad.
Yeah, and that was sport, exercise science and sport performance.
Yes.
Yes. So with that whole, because I found the same thing with the strength and conditioning industry, because it's what I was back when I went to college, there wasn't a specific degree, for like strength coach or stuff like that. So it was just hodgepodge together as an independent studies degree. And after it only took me one internship.
Oh yeah.
And then, meeting other people and then seeing how often you would have to move and how little the pay.
Yeah, you better love it.
Yeah, you better love it. And you better have a lot of patience, which looking back now, that's everything, right? Everything takes a lot of time. But there were so few people that were what I would consider able to make a living, doing it, that it became, I guess I'm going to be a personal trainer, and it shifted that way. But for the same reason that you were studying it, I just wanted to learn how to be a better power lifter.
Yeah.
Because bro science, I was very familiar with it in gym since I was 12 years old. They're all private clubs. And that gets you so far, as we'll discuss as we go on. But then there's got to be something else. But what I ran into, and I'm wondering if you found the same thing, or actually both you guys, because your degrees in exercise science and nutrition.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And it's here. I know the PhD kind of tells everything that happens underneath it. The way I kind of look at that is the lower level courses were frustrating for me when I was going through, because it was so outdated that it didn't resonate with anything.
Yeah.
On the nutrition side, really, really bad. But the basics are still the basics. So that was in there. Did you have that same thing? And did that change as you moved into the master's and the PhD side?
Well, I think with the experience of being around powerlifting in general, you had an idea of first what the trends were. Trends come, they go, whatever. But you can see what's kind of on the cutting edge, because it happens in the gym first for several years before it ever gets into a research laboratory.
Mm-hmm.
And then they try to justify or figure out what the important things are in different methods. But for me, it was such the undergrad part was just building your basics, building the foundation, just like lifting, just like anything else. You have to have a foundation of knowledge to be able to build on that in the future. And a lot of times it's learning what you're eventually going to unlearn later. It's kind of like playing jazz and music. You learn all the music theory, and then really good jazz musicians know how to ignore and break all those rules. So that's kind of what it turned into. You figure out what the basics are, what's established, and then you start digging into research in your grad school, master's, PhD, and figure out how to rip all that research apart. It basically turns into a bullshit filter.
Yeah.
And you really start learning a lot at that point.
Well, it's an interesting, I see it kind of like as a bell curve. Like when we start this stuff, you don't know anything, right? You just know the basics that the guys in the gyms are telling you, but you kind of know you don't know anything. Then you start learning and you start going up this learning curve. And I can plot people on it now, who are online or, influencers or where you can kind of plot exactly where they are. Whereas you learn more, your ego starts to build a little bit. You start to apply some of it. It starts to working. And then as you get closer up to that, wherever your top is, everybody's top's going to be a little bit different. When it gets close to your top, then the way you speak changes. The way you write changes, because now you're trying to impress all your peers with big words and then all this other stuff. Then after a while, you start kind of like coming down the other end. And then you're back down here like, I don't know a friggin' thing about what's going on. But you have that bullshit filter to kind of go in there, where the people that are up here are the ones that speak in absolutes. And I know you guys know what I'm talking about, because you listen to it and you're like, yeah, okay.
Yeah, this is the way.
Kinda. And then 10 years later, if they're still around, which normally is never the case, then all of a sudden it's like, well, it depends.
Yes.
So it comes from, I don't know, absolute answer, it depends.
Yep.
Now with yourself, when did you, in high school, you track and field and cross country and stuff like that.
Yes.
When did your passion for training or BJJ start?
So I didn't start training until I was 19. When I went to college, I went to Washburn University in Topeka.
And what was the aspirations when you went there?
I was actually a graphic designer.
Okay.
I was an art major. Topeka has a really bad crime. So I took a self-defense class. The ladies who taught self-defense did Hawaiian Kempo. So I was like, I want to learn karate. So I went to the gym, took a karate class. I was hanging out after class, and my sensei is like, hey, Jiu-Jitsu is about to start if you want to stick around. Stuck around, never left. So yeah, it was just that one class.
What about it?
For me, it was the fact that it was real fighting. Like with sparring and stuff, you hit each other, but you always pull your punches. You're never going all out. With jiu-jitsu, you go all out because as soon as your opponent taps, all the pain is gone. So the risk of hurting each other is so much lower, but it's so much more realistic. And for me, I had an older brother who picked on me quite a bit, some might say beat me up a little too much. And so
Dang it, Doug.
to do jujitsu where I was the only female and there was about a dozen guys, it was a small class. But to get to the point first where they were all beating me up. And then after a few months, I'm starting to hang with them. And then after about 6 months to 9 months, I was tapping all of them except for 2. And so for me, that was that empowerment that a lot of females I think are looking for, is that I don't have to be a victim. This can teach me to be strong. And it's not just physically strong, because I was only 155 pounds, very little muscle. And these were 200-pound men, like they were grown men. But when you know how to move your body and you know the technique, you can start taking, advantage of these larger opponents and capitalize on their mistakes. And that's what I loved about it.
So you felt that empowerment that first day?
Not that first day. No, the first day I felt like a nail getting beat up.
Well, I know I'm trying to determine like what about that first day, unless it was a class you signed up for and you're like committed and have to be accountable for 6 weeks. What about that first day made you want to go back?
It was the fact that we learned triangle chokes from the legs. So you're in a position where it's like, this is a very vulnerable position, especially for females, that can turn into a very dominant position. So it was mainly that drilling part that I was like, this is what could happen. And then, sparring part, I got wiped. But that knowing that this is available if you learn it. And that's what got me hooked.
And then what led to the competing?
So with the competing, I did the karate tournaments, just like, all.
Well, how far since that first class did you do your first tournament?
A year.
Okay.
Within a year. So within a year, I was doing the karate tournaments. The local jiu-jitsu tournaments, I was against males. There were no female brackets. And then I believe it was 2002 is when I did the sport.
Well, let's still hold on. So we got to go into this a little bit, right? So you're the only female there. So how are you treated? How are you welcomed? How do you feel during this whole time?
So I did not know that they were trying to get rid of me. The guys.
Well, that's probably a good thing you didn't know, right?
Well, because I grew up on a farm. Nothing was easy. You worked hard all the time. That's just how I was raised. And so to get there and to be pushed as hard as the guys were, to me, I was like, this is completely normal. My older brother and I were expected to do the same amount of work on the farm. Training with these guys, I'm expected to do the same amount of work. So I had no idea until about a decade later when my sensei is like, yeah, we tried to get rid of you, but you wouldn't leave.
So when you went to the tournament, though, how was that?
So my very first tournament, I was going against Morgan Bracken, which I can name names because we're now friends. At the time, we were not. I was going against him, and this was unlimited time. And we're about 10 minutes into the match, and one of his buddies from the sideline yells, "Don't let a girl beat you." And you see me on the film look and glare at that guy, and then I end up submitting Morgan. And then we butted heads, and then as we got older and we both realized we love jiu-jitsu, we have no animosity toward each other. Now we're really good friends. But yeah, at the time, that's kind of what I was going against, was these guys that are like, don't let a girl beat you. And so of course I had to beat them.
So at what point did the graphic design take a back seat to the exercise science and nutrition part?
So in 2002, when I did that sport jiu-jitsu, I was actually finally against a female. I won nationals and got on the world team. And so I took a semester off from school. That's what I told my parents. I was fully intending to never go back to school. And so I had that semester off where I was only training and working as a graphic designer. And that's when I learned that I love graphic design. I do not like when people tell me, hey, make something cool, but I don't know what I want. You make something cool, and they're like, that's not what I want. It's like, so that got to be frustrating. And also because I was training so much, I remembered my love for athletics. Because my senior year of high school, I had 2 knee surgeries. So I didn't really get to be active. So when I started college, I was still inactive, and then started jiu-jitsu. And so that kind of got me refocused on how much I love athletics. And because of my past history with injuries, that's how I got into the athletic training. Because it's like, injuries are going to happen. I know they're going to happen. How can I manage them? And that's what led that path.
So what year was that in your undergrad that you started to make that transition, or did you finish?
02, 03. Yeah. I switched halfway through from a BA to a BS.
Yes. So
my undergrad took 5.5 years because I had all the art prerequisites, had to go back and do science prereqs.
Okay. And then what led to the master's, the PhD?
So master's was in sports studies, which is basically sport administration, because I thought I wanted to own a gym.
Okay.
And during that time, I did non-thesis option. So for my graduation requirements, I basically shadowed my sensei on how he ran the school. And I did that for a few months. And when I did that, I realized I did not want to own a school.
Yeah. Why?
Mainly it's just all the other stuff, trying to get the people to pay their bills and the upkeep of the gym and that sort of thing was not fun. I just like teaching people. I don't like being responsible for anything. So that kind of led me to like, okay, I still love training and all of that, but I don't want to own a gym. And I was at that time, now I'm into my pro MMA career. And I still knew nothing about nutrition. So I'd been in college for 7 years now and only had one nutrition class that entire time.
Now, was the pro MMA because there wasn't enough women in BJJ?
Right. Yeah. All I wanted to do was grapple. So I don't know if you've seen my MMA fights. I had a very unique style. I blocked punches with my face and pulled guard because I wanted to grapple. That's all I wanted to do. So, but I didn't know how to cut weight. And so I was doing it completely wrong. And so when I finished that sports studies degree, I was like, I need to learn about nutrition.
Well, what is completely wrong?
So I would fast 2 weeks out from the event, water cut 2 weeks out from the event, and then so yeah, just completely horrible in terms of depleting myself and trying to train. And then as soon as I would weigh in, I was eating Twix bars and Reese's peanut butter cups and coming in just bloated and horrible. So yeah, I realized that was not the best way to do it.
Yeah. So the leaning towards the nutrition was to learn how to
absolutely cut. Yeah, and my dissertation was actually on the use of higher protein diets as an alternative to traditional weight cutting. So I took military combatives athletes and I let one group do the bro science, so all the bad things I was doing, and then my group, I put them on a higher protein diet with moderate carb intake, and we did DEXAs and everything and led up to the event. And that is the only year that Fort Riley won the combatives tournament. I'm not saying it was because I, helped all the athletes, but it was the only year they won.
Now, outside of bouncing while you were in college, which I have to ask you about that, what other work were you doing while you were in college?
Oh, I did so much. So when I was in school, I had a full course load. In undergrad, I was an athletic training major, so I also had to do about 20 hours of athletic training time, and then I would have a job on top of that. So it was either being a bouncer, I was a security guard, I was a maintenance crew for apartments, I worked at Arby's for a while. So yeah, just a variety. I was a waitress, I worked as a barista, so all kinds of different jobs.
So where's the bouncer rank on this list of...
Being a bouncer was fun. So that was during my pro MMA days. It was towards the end of undergrad, so that would have been 04, 05. It was when I was a bouncer that I learned that people don't tap on the street.
Drunk people do.
So how I learned this one night, it was a Sunday night, and so Sundays were normally really calm nights, so there was usually only one bouncer on staff. That night, it was me. And there ended up the bar owner and another gentleman got into a scuffle. And these guys were both very large men, probably like 250, classic bar patron, big old bellies. And so the two of them are bumping bellies and getting in each other's face. And I'm like, okay, I got to diffuse this situation. I have no backup whatsoever. And so I run up behind the guy, jump off the pool table and get him in it. Because they're tall. I'm only 5'7". These guys are over 6 foot. And so I parkour off the pool table and I put the patron in a rear naked choke. And I've got it in. I got hooks in. And in my head, I'm like, okay, I've got this guy. He's going to calm down. He's going to tap. The situation's going to be diffused.
He's going to tap.
And he drops to his knees. And I've still got the choke in. I'm like, okay, he's going to tap really soon. And he timber falls to his face out cold. And that's when I was like, oh yeah, they don't know how to tap.
Yeah.
So that was
what work were you doing while you were in college?
I was working at a gym, surprisingly.
Okay.
Not too much money coming in, but I got pretty lucky. I had a stipend from my dad being in Vietnam, which I was incredibly grateful for. It helped pay for a few years of school, and that helped me pay the bills enough to get through undergrad. Eventually that turned into doing work with RP when I was in grad school, and that helped get me through. But I was fortunate in that way, for sure. Yeah. Thanks to my dad doing his service.
Now you both have been with RP for about a decade, right?
Yes. I was hired a month before him. I'm his superior.
Okay, very cool. So yes, so that's, I should have put that in the introduction because you've worked with thousands of clients, over that period of time, ranging from, basic gen pop to elite athletes. So that becomes an interesting conversation there too, because you got to balance, between those. And just for the listeners that are aspiring to have a career like that, how much of your demographic is the elite athlete?
Oh man, few and far between. Very, very far between.
Yeah.
That's why I actually got my RD, is because I wanted to work more with the general population, because that's who needs us the most.
Yes.
And most of them have some sort of health condition. So you need that RD, so you not only can help them with their performance, but also manage whatever health condition they're dealing with on top of that.
Well, I think that's, people need to understand the reality of that career and the career that it is, because I wanted to just be a strength coach and work with best athletes.
Right.
And then you find yourself in a gym and you have maybe one person that might play high school athletics. Everybody else is gen pop. And I had to start attending seminars and doing additional studying of things because I didn't know how to train gen pop.
Yeah.
Most of the gyms I grew up in, there was always a plate left on the bar. And that was just the warm-up weight, which is stupid now that I think back, even with that.
That's how it goes.
But I remember one of the first days, one of my first clients was having a bench and I just throw a quarter on each side and it took it out. And it's like, your hands are on the bar and it's like, you missed it. And obviously I adjusted after that point. But I went home and told my wife, man, I don't know what I got into. There was this dude in there today that's like 255 pounds, couldn't bench 95 pounds.
Yeah.
And he did the bar, so I didn't just throw the quarter on. So he did the bar. And there was enough indicators there that I should have known, but I'd never seen anybody that, was at that level, which is training-wise, you're dealing with what I would consider regressions, instead of what we all love, which is the progressions, of the elite athlete. And I was just speaking to somebody the other day that was on their track and said that that's what they want to do, is they just want to work with elite athletes. And I'm like, I highly suggest you start, contacting other people that have been in the industry for a decade or so and just ping them and ask for a conversation and see what they say.
Yeah.
Because
it's a whole different world.
Yeah. I think I was, and maybe you guys were as well, under this impression that once this is all done and the education's there and I start marketing myself, I'm going to be working with NFL players and top elite powerlifters and all these other people. But then you find out half that demographic can't afford for training, and the other half, is kind of stuck into whatever world they're in, pro athletes with their strength coaches and all the crap that's a whole topic that we can get into with that as well. Because when you work with those, it becomes a challenging endeavor as well. I want to go into different segments of topics, right? So I think the first one to jump off on would just be periodization, across the board, because there's other things like recovery and longevity and all those branch out of having a solid periodized program where you work more in training blocks, right? Which is just explain basic periodization for the listeners out there, right? Because the way that I would dump it out there, the way I tell people to kind of dip their toes in the water is look up Western linear periodization, which is actually periodization, right?
Yeah.
And then after that, look up more block oriented type periodization, which is still the same.
Yeah, it's all the same concept.
But for myself learning this, when I learned them independently, like the linear was first because that's just what everybody did.
Right.
And then it was just diving deep into that. The block came later, in college when you stumble across that. And there's more than 4 blocks, which is what the linear is, right? Right. So that's kind of where that changed. And then looking at just bodybuilding methods. And once you have a basic understanding of all 3, try to figure out what's similar amongst the 3.
Yeah.
And then kind of branch off from there. But when I say things like that, I leave out parts that are progressive overload is associated with each one, just in different schemes. So how would you, on a basic layman's level, explain periodization for strength and conditioning? Let's just stay powerlifter oriented for now, because it can, when you start throwing in all these other blocks, it can become overwhelming if they don't understand that basics.
Sure. Farthest away from a powerlifting meet, you would have a general preparation phase where you're training hypertrophy for the most part, general health. If you've got any, if you've gained too much weight going into a meet, you usually try to take it off in that time period where you're doing higher volume training. But it's more of a general maintenance, trying to get back to being healthy, get your joints feeling better, and then building up your general traits. It's not going to be that super high-end, high-intensity strength, but you're going to start working on all those lacking features, like if you've got particular weak points, things like that. But it's a much more generalized approach. Moving into what Verkhoshansky called a transmutation phase, we start hitting the middle ground between general adaptations and general health and well-being and athleticism, whatever you want to be. And it's kind of right in the middle of that and the high-end strength work, super high intensity stuff. It's a transitional phase to where you're basically creating a bridge to the two sides. And that helps build potential for much better adaptations when you get closer to a meet or you're working those high absolute intensities. So it's more of a way to transition and hit all the different traits that you need to be a successful athlete.
Now, you worked under Dr. Stone, right?
Yes.
So it's, when you look at his work, then you look at Verkhoshansky's work, this was interesting to me.
Yeah.
There were some people that were trying to say that completely different, years ago. Mm-hmm. But when you look a little bit deeper into the weeds, they were kind of uncovering the same things.
That was a beautiful thing in the history of sports science to me. One of the most.
And they didn't communicate with each other.
No, Doc doesn't speak a damn word of Russian.
Yeah. Yes.
But yeah, it was wild because you had an accidental double-blind research method going on, one in the Soviet Union and one in America with Dr. Stone and his work in the 70s and 80s. And it wasn't until probably the 90s or so that they actually got to see each other's work. And it was one of those moments, in Dr. Stone's classes, we were looking at a lot of Verkhoshansky's work. And it was like we had different words for different things, and there were, bells and whistles that were tuned a little differently, but they found basically the exact same thing. You have a general preparation phase that allows you to be healthy and build up general attributes, and then your transmutation phase, and then you have a competition phase. And the way they waved intensities were pretty similar. The overall timelines were pretty similar. And I think it's one of the coolest things that's ever happened in sports science.
That's where, when I make that recommendation of look at the different models and then try to look to see what's the same, that was one of the things that kind of popped to me. Was if you just looked at the program, like here's the sample program that usually they didn't write, somebody else wrote, said it was that.
Yeah.
And then it's, you can see all these differences. They look like it's completely different because you don't know the nuance, behind what's really going on. But once you know the nuance, it's like, oh my, these are all the same. And to a certain degree, Bompa kind of falls in there with being that as well. And it's all in there. And it's interesting when different methodologies develop different cults.
Yeah.
Right? But yet the underlying of what all of them are doing is the same thing.
Yeah. I tell people all the time, if you lift heavy, you lift often, you have good technique, and you manage your fatigue, you've got all the ingredients for a good training program. And that was the common threads that I saw in all of them. Mm-hmm. They all have aspects of those things and techniques, the application and the coaching of it. But those are the most important things. And once you starting to see those common threads, regardless if it's strength training or anything else in life, if you're really diving in deep to research anything, whether it's business or anything else, any science, you start to see those common threads running parallel to each other in every successful program or coaching method, then you're on something.
With powerlifting, the technique aspect, I feel is greatly overlooked. Because when I asked Jen how she periodizes her technique, it's going to become glaring why it's overlooked. Because every other sport has practice.
Sure.
Right. So for young powerlifters, a lot of the programs will just call for them to squat maybe once a week, maybe twice a week, 5 sets, maybe 10 sets per week, 10 first reps, something like that, where if they treated that as this is a skill, a sport like BJJ, there would be hundreds of repetitions, over every week, sometimes thousands, to be able to develop that movement pattern. So I've always wondered with beginning powerlifters, like, why is their warm up just not broomstick squats, benching with a bar, deadlift with 95 pounds, just to reinforce that groove? Because that would be way more effective from a skill perspective than walking on a treadmill for 10 minutes or doing leg swings, you know, and a lot of the other things that go on in there. And where now I'm going to kind of prove it. So how when you periodize your strength, you know, for your sport, how does that work over, how many times a year do you compete?
There's at least 2 major competitions, if not 4, depending on what I want to do.
All right. So let's say there's 2. Then how would the strength work be periodized, the weight room work?
If I only do Pans and Worlds, which Pans is usually in April and Worlds is always in August. So that one I can always count on. Leading up to Worlds, the 8 weeks leading up to Worlds, it's only 2 days of lifting because the jiu-jitsu is so intense. And when I'm about 3 weeks out from Worlds, my lifting, it's still 2 days a week, but it's maybe a 30-minute session because the jiu-jitsu at that point is at like a 12 out of 10. It's so high that if I want to be able to recover at all, I've got to bring the lifting down. I don't want to stop lifting, but I got to bring it way down. And then, so if we take, let's go like after Worlds. Okay, so we did the 8 weeks leading up to Worlds, very little lifting, tons of jiu-jitsu, go win Worlds again. And then
and again.
And then after Worlds, for myself and any of my athletes that I'm working with, that is the ideal time for strength improvement, because after Worlds, you're going to go ham on food. Because you've been training, and even if you're not, like my weight class is open-ended, but I'm still controlling my diet because I need to be at a certain weight where I feel comfortable enough that I'm not going to get thrown around by the big girls, but small enough that I can move quickly. And so I still have to maintain my weight. But once I get done, you know, there's going to be about a month of very loose dieting, you know, just kind of eating what I've been craving. And during that time is the ideal time to be focusing on strength. So, and jiu-jitsu is going to come way down just because you're so beat up. You've got to take some time off the mats. Obviously not completely time off, but significant reduction, maybe only training 2-3 times a week just so your body can heal, because shoulders are messed up, elbows messed up, everything's messed up. So you're eating a lot. You can lift safely at that time, bring jiu-jitsu down. Ideal time for a strength hypertrophy meso, if not 2 hypertrophy mesos. If you plan to do Pans, which would be about 6 months later, then I would recommend 1 hypertrophy meso and then move into 2 strength mesos leading up to Pans, because that'll bring down your training volume because your jiu-jitsu volume is going to go up. And then when you get within 6 to 8 weeks of Pans, then it's going to be power meso, tons of jiu-jitsu. And then same thing after Pans, strength, and then, hypertrophy, strength, power. If you have time, if you're not going to do Pans, then you could do more hypertrophy if needed. I mean, I'm pretty much stacked, so I'm as big as I need to be.
Yeah. Well, even with that, it's still, as we get older, you don't want to lose. Yeah. You know, so the training.
And that's a really good point, because I am a master's athlete. So that hypertrophy block after you're getting ready for one of the major competitions is a big deal, because we are trying to attenuate that loss of strength that just naturally occurs as we get older, as we get beat up and we can't do certain things. So even, I'm always going to be doing a hypertrophy block, if nothing else, just to kind of regain what I lost leading up to the tournament, because I was so focused on jiu-jitsu.
Where the main takeaway there's the focus on the actual sport.
Yes.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
Which, and when you're dealing with periodization in sports, that becomes more complicated as far as kind of putting those blocks together, but not so much, right? Sure. Because it's more like a balance. It's managing the fatigue, which we're going to get into a little bit more. When you were competing, you started out, I believe, Conjugate, and then kind of moved more into block. Yep. Where explain that timeline, and because it's kind of one of those bell curve type things too, right? Where you don't think it's really this simple, so it has to be complicated. Sure. And then you overcomplicate it, and then you realize later it's kind of really simple. So explain how that kind of led into your blocks of 15, 10, 5, 3, and singles, and then I believe with each block your gear increased.
Sort of,
like,
yeah.
Like the 5s, the 10s were wraps. Then,
I probably did that on squats or something.
Yeah, and then the 5s were, the last block obviously is full gear.
Yeah.
All right. So kind of lead me through that whole timeline and how everything kind of fell into place with that.
Well, one thing that I really benefited from with doing like the traditional West Side Conjugate style training with bands and chains and the boxes and all that stuff was I learned intent in how to lift. Like lifting with a maximum force output, not just giving enough effort to complete the rep, but you are executing the technique and the rep to get a specific response from your body. And I think that had huge neural benefits as far as motor patterns and the amplitude of the neural signal going through the muscles for a super forceful contraction. And after I built up a lot of strength for that, it was running a parallel to my education as well. And I started understanding fatigue management to a much larger degree. And I remember stories about guys at Westside, like Chuck would only go heavy like 1 day a week or something. Like they had like a meat day in his training, something along those lines. I was like, okay, so these guys, as they get stronger, they start getting beat up more. The injuries seem to come along a lot more often, and they start either on purpose or accidentally from injury having to downregulate their training. And I was like, okay, I see a trend here. This is making sense. So as I started learning more about block periodization, I figured out if we wave intensities, not only worked in 4-week blocks most of the time, it made it really easy to schedule. My dissertation was even on that. So we found the same effects with that with the disabled powerlifting for bench press. But I only went like a real max weight once a month on squat variation and bench press variation.
Well, let's back up a little bit because that's how it ended up.
Sure.
Right. Because in my mind, in theory, you will know better, is the larger the load, the harder it's going to be to recover from.
Yes.
Right. Because it's on the spinal loading and the nervous loading. 900 pounds is different than 400 pounds, even if 400 pounds is your best squat.
Yep.
It's just more weight. So it's harder to recover from. So you ended up at that spot, if I'm understanding you correctly, because you started to see other people were getting beat up.
Sure.
And I don't believe you suffered any major injuries at all through your powerlifting career.
No, I think that was a really big reason why, is because I managed fatigue. And I honestly, watching crazy training videos and you see people go into failure and being super intense, like, oh yeah, it's what I love about the training. And then you think about, okay, but does that feed into my goal? And it quickly became apparent that if you can avoid injury, you're going to pass a lot of people on the way, the tortoise and the hare kind of scenario. But when I learned about the periodization aspects and going through the different phases and phase potentiation, how one phase or block leads into the next and helps create more progress in the next block, not just what you're doing at the time, but it sets you up for more progress after that, and then after that. And it just keeps on building over time. Then you have your built-in fatigue management that helps you avoid injuries. Like, okay, there's a positive trend going over a really long-term plan here. And that started to make a lot more sense. And I had a really good base built from doing all the West Side stuff earlier on in my career, which was very successful. But I was able to take that foundation and then refine it by going heavy once a month and then starting with high volume 6 months out from a meet, which would help with all the hypertrophy. It also took load off my joints. That was a really, really big aspect of it, because I wasn't putting 800, 900, 1,000, 1,100 pounds on my back anymore. I needed to start building up, and I was able to avoid injury and avoid the complications of having heavy weight on me all the time. And I would start getting body composition changes, which in weight class sport, very important. So if I needed to cut, I would do it in those higher volume phases, set myself up at least 8 weeks out from the meet at the body weight I needed to be within cutting range, and then not have to worry about it so much getting closer to the meet. I wouldn't have to change my training or my diet too much. I was smooth sailing after that point. But each block, starting with really high volumes, fed into the next, and eventually working down 10s, 5s, 3s, and then doubles and singles without equipment. That's when I was definitely in belt and wraps for my squats and things like that. Maybe use a slingshot for whatever we had back in that day. They're really, I guess they're weaker back then than they are now.
Yeah.
But after a 4-month progression from high volume to basically a raw powerlifting meet in my garage, that's when I put equipment on. And then I would start with threes in my equipment, working bench press. I probably wasn't touching very much, but it was getting the motor patterns down. That was the big thing, getting the neural adaptations, because the muscle was there, the overall strength was there, but getting the neural adaptations and the motor patterns refined, because they are very, very different in multiply equipment especially.
Well, when you were doing the raw work, was your biomechanics on the bench the same as when you had the shirt on?
Yeah. If I wanted to have higher raw numbers, I wouldn't have lifted with the technique that I did.
Yeah.
But even when I was doing my unequipped work, I was still squatting in a wide stance. I was still benching with a big arch and with a wide grip most of the time, unless I had a different variation I needed to address a weak point or something. But I was sticking to those technique points very, very often. Now, because it's a sport, right?
With each block, were you changing the variation outside of leading into the meet, say off season? Were you changing the variation of the stance for each block? Or
if I was far away from a meet, that's when I would do that. The closest I would have a different variation compared to competition techniques would be when I was doing like a 5x5 unequipped, which was 4 months out. The last 3 months for sure, usually 4 months, were very competition technique oriented. So it's that practice that you were talking about.
So, and when you're in the 10s and the 15s, is it closer stance and stuff like that?
Yeah, big range of motion, bodybuilding type movements, but I didn't get away completely from powerlifting priorities because I was always training my spine to be super rigid and hold and arch. And that was one of the integral parts of my squat technique. I had to be completely upright, and I had to have a low back arch in the lumbar spine that was locked in and never let go, because that's what pulled all the tension in my hamstrings, allowed me to use my glutes so well, and all the other hip extension contributors there. So if I lost that, then I wasn't going to be able to apply it when I got back into full gear or the heavy singles and doubles and things like that. So I kept that in. But everything else, big knee joint range of motion, deep squats, close stance, just building up general musculature over that time.
Now, in hindsight, would you have, we can all say looking back, this is what I would have done. Would you have thought that it would have been better if you trained that way the whole time? And then the second question to that would be, if you did train that way that whole time, because there's some people that may, then how would you go about keeping the mental fortitude to know when you're going through the 10s, the 15s, and the 5s that it's going to be there when the 3s and 1s, because you already had that base.
Yes.
And you've already done many meets. So you kind of figured out it does matter how you train for a meet, but what really matters is where you are 6 weeks out.
Yeah.
And how would you answer that question there? Right? Because because you can sit there, I could sit there and say, yeah, it would be better if you did that. Mm-hmm. But then we remove one critical aspect, and that's, would that mental confidence have been there after 4 months of loads that are probably not under 80%, for those phases, that it will come back. Yeah, that's why most people don't do it.
Right. It's a scary thing. Because your top end strength does go down.
Yeah.
But most of that's neural, because it's not the same neural stimulus to the brain that feeds into the muscles through your spinal cord and nervous system. So it's just having the faith that it does come back. And that's a big, big thing that I learned from digging into the research of block periodization, is that even though you can't exude those traits that you had in those strength blocks while you're going through high volume, you're increasing your potential to regain those traits plus some over time. You just have to take time away from it, rebuild your base, and then continue building on that. Because just because you can't have a certain level of performance at one point in time doesn't mean that it's not going to come back when you start training like that again. Mm-hmm. And we really dug into the research and did training studies about steps going over time, but a much more positive trend.
Now, there's something you said earlier about the intent of the rep. Mm-hmm. So what is the research, because I know anecdotally, what does the research say if you're in a hypertrophy phase? And this would apply to BJJ as well, right? Sure. So if you're in a hypertrophy phase and you're a strength athlete or athlete compared to just bodybuilding, when it comes to the intent. By intent, I mean how much force you're putting into each repetition after maybe the first one or two. If I'm set at 15, you're not going to be applying maximum force on
Sure.
But the intent anecdotally matters if it's a strength athlete or athlete with that compensatory acceleration, even with the hypertrophy work, where I don't know if it matters as much if the goal is just to increase muscle mass.
Sure.
What's the research say along that, or what do you feel about that?
There is research showing that if you do intentionally slower movements, you don't have the same type 2 fiber shifts to the higher performance end than you do if you are moving with maximal intent or being as explosive as possible. Just basically moving the weight as fast as you can on the way up on your push or your pull. And that's pretty solid because they do muscle biopsies and they can actually put them under a microscope and see the fibers. They put little different dyes on them and stuff. So it's pretty conclusive in that way. Strength results and lots of other training studies show that as far as the training results. But that was one of the fun things about knowing Dr. Mike when he was in his bodybuilding phase. When I was an undergrad, he was doing his master's at the same school where we got to know each other. We were both training on different ends of the spectrum because he was still lifting pretty explosively now, more so than he does now because of the injury risk and the complications there. But I was always lifting super explosively on the lower volume range, and he was always doing higher volumes, but not as explosively. And you kind of get that intuitive understanding of what the difference is over time. So I was always able to jump a lot better than he was. And and then you extrapolate that into seeing the research that backs that up. It's like, oh, this is why. And a lot of times your experience in the gym or in the sport that you play feeds into, okay, these things seem to be true. And then in the research, you see, oh, that's why it's true. That's the nuts and the bolts and the gears turning in the background. It's like, oh, okay, yeah, maybe we can accentuate these different things to feed back into this that we're doing and competing in. And that was really the whole goal of going to school to begin with, honestly.
Yeah. How would the nutrition part feed in to the ability to have that intent, right? Especially, and as you get closer to whatever you're training for, the reality is you're still accumulating damage. I mean, it's managing fatigue, but it's kind of a losing battle at a certain point where it's more mitigating damage at that point, where nutritionally, if it's a wreck, I'm going to assume that the ability, to have that maximal intent is going to be hindered.
Absolutely. Yeah. Especially if you're having to cut weight. So if you're in a caloric deficit, it's going to be really hard to do that really high volume explosive training simply because you don't have enough fuel in your tank. And so you may need to bring down the volume a little bit so you can be explosive for the reps you can successfully do in a safe manner in your caloric deficit. And work on it that way as you get closer to your event.
So that's the singles. Is it singles or does it stay triples?
For me, I always stay either 3 to 5. I never go singles just because of the risk of injury. And jiu-jitsu is my main focus. So if I'm going to get hurt, it's going to be there, not lifting.
Not that you've ever gotten hurt.
I never get hurt.
Yeah. With getting back to the periodization and the training stimulus, which the training stimulus is kind of the easiest part to figure out.
Oh, yeah.
The management of the recovery becomes the more challenging. And I don't want to say it's underrated at this point because it's spoke about way more than it probably ever has been. But what are metrics that you use with your clients or that you used for yourself, acquired through the PhD, to be able to know exactly where you are as far as your adaptation and your recovery status?
There's a few that I work from. I really like velocity-based training to where, because my dissertation was on that. We use that as a monitoring tool. So my bench press athlete would press 100 kilos for, I think it was 2 sets of 2 sets of 3, something like that. And we would monitor the velocities over time. And when he was more fatigued, those velocities went down. When he was better recovered, they went up. We also did grip dynamometer testing. We saw the exact same trends on that. But since neural fatigue impacts grip a bit more, we got to see a little bit different of a change, because peripheral fatigue, like in the actual muscle tissue, impacts bigger lifts. But the neural side seemed to recover just a few days quicker than the actual overall systemic fatigue. So you can take that however
Yeah.
you want to. But with clients, some people I do have using VBT, but others I'll have take heart rate measurements. We can look at heart rate variability and what their actual resting heart rate is right after they wake up usually. If it's a higher resting heart rate, we know that there's some kind of stress on the body. We don't know if it's specifically from training or not, because you have the same trends when you're getting sick. If you're going through personal issues, divorce, or your significant other breaks up with you, you got a parent that's sick, you're always going to see that stress response that looks similar. So it's not, we don't know if you're training too much, but we know something's happening, especially if that happens.
What difference becomes significant?
When we see it happen over the course of a few days.
I'm talking more from a standard deviation standpoint from each day, like how much, because there's going to be some variance.
Sure. Yeah.
Right.
There's a daily fluctuation range, and this was in my dissertation. But anytime we saw something outside of 2 standard deviations, up or down, we knew that there was, based on the normal model of a statistical process control chart, which is used in everything. If it was outside of that 2 standard deviation range and it stayed there, it was like, there's a tiny chance that this is a coincidence. So this must be something significant.
Stay there for how long?
3 days usually. 2 days can be a coincidence. 3 days is a trend.
All right. Well, I'm asked that because I think if people are using that, they need to understand there's going to be daily deviations the same way there's daily deviations on how much you weigh in the morning.
Right.
Where I'm sure you've had clients that are freaking out because, oh my God, I gained 2 pounds. And it's way the next day. They ate something different.
I call that the WTF principle, because you look down at the scale and you think obviously WTF, but it's the weight loss timeline fluctuation principle.
Yeah. To
where you have around 2% of your body weight up or down from the average weight that you have. It's completely expected. So a lot of times that's, 3, 4, 5 pound range. And people are freaking out over, a half pound or 1 pound that changes on the scale. It's like, no, this is nominal. It's barely even noticeable in the grand scale of things.
So if it's over 3 days and it's a client that you're working with, do you just pause, or do you start to make changes then, or do you wait for a week? Because there's still, that could just be 3 bad days.
Sure.
So at what point in time is it like, oh, wait, we have to adjust, we have to change something?
Yeah. Well, the thing is, those are all secondary metrics. The number one metric is talking to the person.
Yeah.
And figuring out what's going on in life. Is everything okay at work? Is family good? Are your kids sleeping okay? Are you sleeping okay? Stuff like that, to get an actual context of what's going on. But a lot of times, if we're in a cut phase and we're starting to see that trend over and over again, it's like, okay, we should probably go to maintenance, because cutting in a high stress situation is usually just a really good recipe for failure. And we'll be able to get back to that later. But a lot of times just dropping volume, going into a deload week a little early, something like that, just reducing intensity or volume and or both is the way to go there.
Where I would see that variation start to occur more so would be, say, as you're in a peak phase, for a tournament, or the lifter is in not what I call the peak phase for a meet is like the deload before the meet. Yeah. So it's the strength accumulate, the back end of the strength accumulation phase is going to be there.
The taper you're talking about?
Yeah. Well, no, not the taper. It shouldn't be there. It's just going to go away. But those last heavy weeks, like the last 3 or heavy weeks that just hurt like a bitch and you're beat up. There may be, that increase in the recovery demand that you really don't have a choice, at that point, because the competition's coming or the meet's coming. So what mitigation measures at that point can be used to help navigate that?
Usually prioritizing sleep, hydration, things like that, because when you have that big peak right before competition, before the taper starts, so you can recover and be at your best on the right day, you should feel like total crap. Like it's an intentional overreach. So all those measures should be going off the charts at that time if you did it right. As long as you don't get hurt, that's exactly where you want to be. We saw that in my dissertation too. Like all those monitoring measures hit the floor, but they also rebounded higher than they ever were.
Would that be overreaching?
Yeah, overreaching, right? And then the supercompensation effect after the taper.
Yeah. And so How do you mitigate that as you're going into a competition if you see that?
Ideally, for myself and for my athletes, going into a competition, I'd love them to be in a maintenance phase. So ideally, they've already done their cut, and then when we get into that final 4 to 6 weeks, it's maintenance, if not longer in maintenance. Because for that very reason, as they start to get closer, they're going to be overreached, they're going to be exceeding their thresholds. We don't need a caloric deficit stress on top of that. So ideally, they're already in a maintenance phase. And then sleep is a really big thing. A lot of athletes, they forgo sleep. They're like, oh, I'm going to get up at 6 a.m. and do a double workout. Sleep, actually, it's better for you to get 2 hours of sleep than 2 hours in a double training session in terms of managing fatigue, especially when you do see those spikes in heart rate. You can still do your primary training session, but you don't need to do extra. Do what is programmed, eat what is programmed, and sleep.
So what are the recommendations you give for sleep hygiene?
At least 8 hours. Some athletes, I personally need 10. I'm a big sleeper. I need a lot of sleep because I'm old, but it's going to be dependent upon the athlete. The athletes that say they only need 6, they need more. If you look at the research, 8 is about the minimum for an actual athlete, and then it can go as high as 12. So somewhere in there. So usually about 8, 9, 10 hours is what I recommend for my athletes.
And if they can't?
If they could get in a nap, that'll help. It will not undo a poor night's sleep, but it will help with bringing down that fatigue.
Yep.
Are there any recommendations that you give them in regards to how to sleep better?
So how to sleep better is going to be setting up your sleep routine. So whatever you do to, like for me, this guy, he comes in, he passes out, no problem. I have to unwind from the day. So I have, my bedtime routine. I do play a game. I'll play probably 3 games, and then I'll put my phone down and I'll turn on a show that I've watched 100 times, because when I was an undergrad, it was Topeka, Kansas. There was gunshots. There was a lot of noise. So I got used to sleeping with the TV on. That's my white noise. Turn that on, turn it down to 12. And then we have an Uller on our bed. So we get the nice cool bed. We got the background noise, and then just kind of relax and go to sleep. But you got to figure out what sleep environment works for you. For me, a completely dark room with no sound, I cannot sleep. I need noise. Mm-hmm. So the athlete has got to figure out what is their ideal sleep environment and how do they get into where they're ready to go to sleep. Do they need to wind down, or do they just come and put a pillow over their head and they're done?
Yeah.
And that's going to be individualized. So they got to kind of figure out, do I need to stretch and then go to bed? Does some deep breathing help calm me down? And that sort of thing. It's just really, it's independent.
A few years ago, a friend of mine turned me on to Chili Pad, mm-hmm. right, which is temperature controlled. So they're actually sponsoring the show now. So it's kind of cool because after 3 years now, they're sponsoring the show. But I've been using this thing for 3 years. For me, it was a game changer, especially when I was bigger, because you're hot. Yes. It's hot as hell. So I have the thing set at like 55 when I get in. But with this, I can change it. So about an hour before I wake, it will pull the temperature up.
That's the best.
So it'll allow me to naturally kind of wake back up again. So I guess for those interested, you can go to www.sleep.me/table talk and save up to $315 on your first order. Bam. Anyhow, that was a freaking game changer.
It was, yeah.
Right? But it wasn't, to be clear, it didn't solve all sleep problems. Right? I don't want people to think, hey, you do this and then boom, you're sleeping 10 hours. You still, need to unwind and all those other, it's an accumulative thing that over a period of time, as I've gotten older, it's been worse, to be able to get in that 8 hours or 9 hours, or when I was younger, I think I was sleeping like 12 freaking hours.
Yeah.
And now I found for myself personally, deep sleep is the biggest metric. And I've tracked this shit with every way you can track it. And I know they all suck, right? I get that, right? We can go into that. I know they all suck. I've used the Oura Ring, the Fitbit, all this kind of stuff. Apple Watch. So in the morning, I'm looking at like 3 different things. Like, what's this? What's this? What's this? And the deep sleep was the one that when I would look back, that mattered the most. If it was 5 hours, if there was 1.5 hours of deep sleep, cool. 10 hours and 30 minutes of deep sleep, not cool. So that's just anecdotally. Is there anything to support that you know of?
Yeah. Yeah. Those recovery metrics all kind of reflect that sleep quality.
But out of those, so you got the REM, you have the deep sleep, you have the different metrics. For myself, I found that deep being the most important, would that be across the board, or is that just anecdotally?
Oh, what do you think?
I would say anecdotally, I agree with them. I have not delved into into the different parts of sleep. But for myself, I'm the same way. If my deep sleep, because I use the Aura ring, and if it's only like 30 minutes, it's going to be a rough day.
When I was using that, it pisses me off sometimes, right? Because it's a hard training day, and it says, nope, it's not good. And I'm like, no,
it's
fuck off.
Happen.
It's going to happen anyhow. Then it does. So I think with those, because scientifically, I believe all these measurements are pretty flawed. Am I correct?
Sure. Oh yeah. The validity is okay. Reliability is a really big issue with all kinds of different things, especially things that are in contact with skin, because I've been around a lot of the studies that were done to validate different things, and half the time we have to put everything in an exact position and like maybe tape it on to make sure it doesn't move and there's not too much sweat underneath it. It changes how it reads things, or it gets bumped, anything like that. And you have to have a perfect situation for it to get the readings that it should in theory. But out in the real world, you don't have any of those controls. So it's incredibly difficult to get something reliable. Like, there are different instruments that tell you how many calories that you burned. And I'll have clients send me in, I burned like 7,000 calories yesterday. I was like, well, if you keep that up, you're just going to be dead. The math doesn't ever work out. And if you're only eating 1,500 calories, you're like, no, that didn't happen. But it's one of those deals to where you take everything with a grain of salt. You have to, because it's not going to, like, the direct math will never work out the way it should.
Yeah. I've tried to look at it as how many days will it say bad, right? So if it says low for 5 days, then maybe I need to check.
Yeah, that's what I recommend, because it's not going to give you like an actual snapshot of your health, but it can give you here's where you're at. Are you staying there, or are you getting above or below that initial point? And that's that cumulative effect, right? Monitoring it over the week. Over the week, is it saying bad? Is it saying, this day's bad, this day's good? Are you kind of just bouncing around and staying level for what that apparatus is measuring? If that particular apparatus is saying your heart rate is spiking for 4 days, and it's like, okay, even if this apparatus is not 100% accurate, it's accurately telling me that I am elevated for 4 days. I need to back off. So that's kind of how I look at it and try to explain to my clients that it's not a perfect measure, but it can show you variability a lot better in how you're doing.
With the HRV, how would, granted, the conversation with the client still, supersedes everything, but with the HRV and somebody is using beta blockers, how do you calculate for that? Right, because that becomes another question too. If you're dealing with different zone cardio training and somebody's using a beta blocker, like how maybe they can't get to zone 2, not because of the effort, but just because the medication is not going to allow that to happen. So does that just become null and void, and then it falls back to the communication on what's going on in your life and all those things?
That's what I was going to say. Yeah, it falls back to the communication aspect, because maybe if you're taking velocity measures, you'd have an idea of readiness for any given training session. But when you throw in a variable like that, you kind of have to toss the heart rate variability stuff out, because there's an outside factor that's impacting it more than the actual fatigue levels.
Yeah, that's been a question that I've kind of put out there, a few different times, because you get older. I know more people that they ask me that. Like, well, so how do I worry about zone 2 if I'm on a beta blocker? I'm like, well, if you're on a beta blocker, I don't know if zone 2 is really your highest priority. Just doing the cardio is probably the higher priority. So don't worry about it. As long as you can still talk at a regular rate, you're good. Just do a lot of that, you'll be fine. Don't worry about it. But they get caught up in, some influencer thread or swipe post that says this is where optimal is. And it's like, well, your optimal's already adjusted, because of that. And you don't want to, I've had people suggest this, that you don't want to go off the shit,
No.
to be able to hit whatever that is, because there's a reason why you're on it in the first place.
Yeah. Don't get lost in the weeds there.
Well, it happens.
Yeah.
Right. Do you see that with your clients often?
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. They get obsessed with all the different metrics that they can use to measure, and they want to send you the data from their Oura Ring and their Fitbit and all of that. And it's like, stop. I don't want to see any of that. I don't want you to track any of that. I want you to focus on your body weight, and I want you to focus on your reps. And then from there, we'll start doing, focus on that for a few weeks. And then if we're still not seeing the results we want, then maybe bring in one other metric. But when my clients first sign up and they've got all these different things they're tracking, it's like you're losing sight of what you really want to accomplish, because you want to adjust these little minute things that are not going to affect the big picture. So let's go big picture items and then narrow down from there.
Yeah.
With training, having a generalized plan, is obviously important. So with your clients with nutrition, having a plan obviously is going to be important. But if it's somebody that's not been, through powerlifting, bodybuilding, or whatever for a period of time, compliance is going to be a huge issue. So how do you navigate that? A lot of people listening probably know they need to eat better.
Yeah.
Right. And to them, they're going to think, well, to eat better means I need to have 4 or 5 meals per day, scheduled like a bodybuilding type of thing. It needs to be chicken, rice, meat. And they'll do it for a day.
Yeah.
2 maybe.
Yeah.
Right. And then it's right back to McDonald's and all the other stuff.
Yeah.
So how do you navigate that?
Big thing I first focus on is planning. I'm a big proponent of plan your meals ahead. Instead of tracking, instead of trying to retroactively correct your diet, plan ahead. And if it is someone, because I've, with my background and having the RD, I've worked with every kind of client. So, say I'm working with a grandma who just wants to be active for her grandkids. So she's never been an athlete, never really had to worry about her diet. It's her first time. So with her, I'm not going to give her a plan that says, I want you eating 18 grams of protein and 30 grams of carbs at this meal. That's too much. I'm going to tell her, I want you to eat 3 ounces of cooked meat, and I want you to eat a cup of carbs. And I'll give her maybe 6 options on the carbs, and keep it really, really simple, and do that for a month. And maybe she only gets 2 of the 3 meals correct. Maybe, she messes up. But over time, she's going to develop that eating habit. And then once she's got that down, then we'll add in another detail. Now we're going to start measuring out some healthy fats, or, something like that. Or maybe, now that she's been with me for a month, she's starting to train regularly. So we're going to start talking about how are we going to adjust your nutrition around that workout window. But you don't want to overload them. You don't have to be perfect on day one. I think that's the biggest thing you see it in jiu-jitsu. They want to come in on day one. How do I get my black belt? You don't. It's day one. Let's focus on the very basics and let's get those down. And once we feel comfortable with those, then we'll add on. And
to validate what you just said, was it 10 years that you had your white belt?
I had my white belt. Yeah, it was 10 years. It took 20 years for me to get to black.
Okay. So let's just kind of throw that out there, that a zillion world titles.
Yeah.
And 10 years as a white belt.
Yeah.
So takes time.
Learn the base. And that's this guy. So when he started, he wanted to watch the YouTube and do some of the crazy stuff. And I had to kind of beat it into him. Focus on literally. he signed on the dotted line. It's fine.
Yeah, there's no punchline there, folks.
But no, it really is, because that's one thing I think technology has hindered, is that it's so easy to see all the fancy things and the minutia and all of that you forget about the basics and the nuts and bolts of it. And that's what you got to get a hold of first before you can start delving into all of these offshoots and all the minute things that you can adjust to make small improvements.
Now you're at a purple belt now. And so how long have you been doing BJJ?
Ever since, first off, I didn't start jiu-jitsu. It started happening to me.
Yeah. Well,
so there was no choice there. I went to the classes trying to learn how to defend myself from this one. But yeah, about 5.5 years. And I had to marry her to get my purple belt. So I don't even know how I'm going to get promoted again. That's like the biggest bullet that I had in the gun.
Yeah, he got promoted at our wedding.
Yeah.
My coach didn't want me marrying a blue belt, so we had to promote him at the ceremony.
Are you shitting me?
Yeah.
He
That's awesome, man.
He objected in the middle of the wedding.
Yeah.
In full Hulk Hogan garb, by the way.
Yeah.
We had 3 flower boys in our ceremony, and they were all dressed up as different versions of Hulk Hogan.
And he had no idea. So I had all the groomsmen had purple T-shirts on under, because the colors were yellow and blue for his blue belt. And so they had on dress shirts that were blue, but underneath everybody had on purple T-shirts. And all the ladies on their bouquets, when they pulled the bottom off, there were purple ribbons. So he gets objected to. And my coach comes up and 2 of our other friends come up and they're undressing him because he had on a blue vest. And they're putting on a blue vest, blue tie. He has no idea what's going on behind him. Yep. Everybody behind him switching to purple. And so he turns around and he's like, oh man, now I don't match. Yeah. And then he sees the entire wedding party is now purple.
I died.
Yeah.
Like we had for our unity ceremony, we had a unity barbell instead of candles or sand or whatever. So I was leaning on that thing, trying not to fall on the floor from laughing so hard. They got me. It was like the wildest surprise ever.
How did you guys meet?
RP.
Yeah. Mike actually kind of set that up. He was texting both of us at the
master puppet. Yeah. Like, I think these 2.
Yeah. Well, he was doing the work there, but his wife Crystal was like, hey, I think there's something there. So he started texting both of us like, hey, what do you think of Dr. Jen? I was like, she's a really incredible athlete. She's got some incredible accomplishments I have a lot of respect for. Blah, blah, blah. I was like, no. I mean, what do you think about her? You know what I mean? I was like, oh, well, I haven't really thought about that. And then we just ended up meeting up soon after at Mike's wedding. So
how long ago was that?
Almost 6 years.
So, yeah.
So, because we'd been colleagues since the beginning, since RP. I met him because Mike and I, we took a group of students to the Arnold Classic and Derek was lifting there. And so I met Derek, and professionally we knew each other for years, but at that time he had been married. And so it was like,
the blinders were on.
Yeah. We did not look at each other that way at all until that evening when Mike's texting both of us and blinders come off, and here we are. So.
All goes back to Dr. Mike.
Yeah. Yeah. He encourages fraternization amongst the employees.
No comment. When you were in your powerlifting career, would it be safe to say that your training was the powerlifting lifestyle, but everything outside of your training until the later time was living more of a Gen Pop lifestyle?
To a certain extent, like when I was competing, I was a competitor, and I draw a very hard line between being a competitor and a participant in different sports. Yeah. The priority was always being the best powerlifter I could be.
But I'll state my reason why I'm asking is with a lot of the powerlifters now, intermediate, and I guess I could probably say all strength athletes, probably all athletes, if I want to be completely honest, across the board, they'll take the training serious like a professional, but then the nutrition and the sleep and the alcohol and all the other stuff like Gen Pop, right? So when there's conversations that I'll have with coaches, and it always kind of goes back to the basics of, here's a healthy diet, here's the sleep, here's all this. They don't listen, right? Because their identity is, I'm this athlete, I'm this athlete. I knew a world-class sprinter one time that came in the West Side, and I asked what he had for that day. It was like 3:00 at the time, and it was 1 cheeseburger. And I'm like, is this normal? Yeah, it's pretty much every day. I'll have a cheeseburger at noon, and then I'll go out to dinner at night. And I'm like, fucking guys in the Olympics. Right. And I think that's more frequent across the board than I think
with high-level athletes for sure.
Yes, where they need to listen to the conversations with the coaches and the trainers that are speaking to your Gen Pop, as you said, that you can't go chicken and rice, immediately. Right. It has to be that slow progression. As you progressed through the sport, did those variables get more dialed in as you became close? I hate to say a genetic ceiling, but I don't know how else to explain that. As you get closer to that, things become harder. Right. Like way harder. And those things then become more valuable.
Yeah. Well, honestly, I was pretty locked in from high school on. Okay. Because I was already researching powerlifting, mainly through looking at your website, as I've told you. And I started understanding through my experiences in sport. I wasn't big. And even though I was smaller than a lot of folks, I wasn't very fast. So it was like, okay, maybe genetics aren't my greatest asset. So everything else I'm going to have to try and optimize as best I can.
Well, you have a pre-existing condition too, right?
Right. Joint dysplasia.
Yes.
Yeah.
So did that play out at all through your career?
Oh yeah. Huge.
How?
That's where I kind of inadvertently learned how little I needed to train to make progress. And I think that's something that carried over in my coaching as well, because it was about maximum efficiency, effort and time put in to the results that you get. Because you can train hard, and there are tons of people can train hard.
Mm-hmm.
They train hard all the time, but a lot of times it's to their detriment as well, because they're accumulating fatigue, injury risk increases, and all those things. But I was forced as a kid to take time away from training, but I was still able to mitigate those things. And through the consistent efforts, eating well, trying to get good sleep, all that stuff, even in high school, because I understood I was in a deficit there. And to be competitive, I needed to optimize all that stuff. It's playing the cards that I had in my hand, and that's all anybody really can do. But with that and the joint dysplasia, I had 7 shoulder dislocations in high school. My right hip came out twice. And, these things weren't good. The doctor told me, you're going to have to give up lifting and contact sports for sure. And I was like, I'll give up half of those. I'm not giving up the lifting. I don't see how the lifting is going to cause major problems. And really, it's the main thing that helped me keep my joints together.
I was going to say I would see it more a benefit.
Yeah. Yeah. But that's, general clinical speak. Like if you're doing anything that's out of the norm, aside from, growing old and rotting to death, it's a risk. But yeah, I mean, that the muscle mass that I've gained over those years, especially through high school, was what kept me from continuing to have those injuries. Man, I can feel it now. If my shoulders get too fatigued, like rotator cuff muscles, delts, traps, all that stuff, I can feel my shoulders kind of starting to slide out of position just because those muscles are more lax.
Does that play into your decision to do things like the Highland Games during off seasons of powerlifting? Sort
of. A lot of that was mental as well, but even taking breaks from powerlifting was oriented back toward being the best powerlifter I could be, because I knew that there was a burnout phase, like post-meet blues. People the next week or two after a competition, a lot of times there's a depression that sets in. And you're trying to figure out, because you're in this transitionary phase where you've got high fatigue and then everything's changed. And I have to look in the future and figure out what you're going to do. What's my next meet? God, do I have to jump right back into training real fast? And figuring out how to step away from all that for the mental health aspect of it and learning other things. Music was a really big benefit for me there too, because I was able to have a completely different outlet for that energy. And it was more of a creative outlet, and it reduced stress and really has got my mind off lifting. But I still throw in the Highland Games now. I just did one a few weeks ago, but I'm not trying to be the best in the world at that. It's just more for the enjoyment of it. I enjoy progressing. I enjoy the competition part of it, but being a competitor is not the top priority there. How do you, because I'm going to assume it's still there, deal with the mental shift of when you're trying to perform at your best, right? And it's a large part of your identity. The way you look at everything is everything that I'm going to do is to make me a better powerlifter, thus education, everything that plays into that. But then you'll have this other voice after you do it for a while that will kind of pop up and say, this is kind of freaking stupid, right? And then you got to take that other voice and say, shut up, and then just focus. So you learn to ignore that other voice, but it's kind of always there. Sure. Post-meet blues, or after you break an all-time world record, it's like great, and then you're back at the hotel, right? And you got stickum and shit all over you, and it's like, I thought there would be more to this. Yes. Than this. And then that voice comes like, what the fuck are you doing? Right? Because the risk is higher. And it's high. Well, you may not know it first. Sure. Like at first you don't know. But as you become more educated, you start to actually see there's a risk here, and I'm willing to pay that cost for whatever that is. But then you retire. And then that voice is still there. Oh, yeah. Right. But now you need to take the voice you've been ignoring and amplify it, and then make the meathead voice, tell that, like, shut up. No. But after a decade or more of that, there's this identity shift and pivot that's any athlete's going to have to deal with. It competes at a high level. How do you navigate that?
Because both voices are still there. Like there's a voice now in me still.
Oh yeah.
That's like, man, my training's going well. Just start blasting shit and go. Like, no, that's dumb. You can't do that. Like, fuck, why can't?
I still think about it every day.
Yeah.
I tell people all the time. They'll ask me, "Do you miss competing in powerlifting?" I'm like, I really miss being able to. Like there was so much stress in living that lifestyle where you're giving up the alcohol and the social outings and really living the life as an athlete, like we were talking about before. I mean, I gave up a lot. And part of it was because I was a bit of an introvert when I was younger, and it made those things easier. So I was kind of gifted in that way, I guess. Gifted to be socially awkward. But I really missed having that ability. And there were 4 words I was absolutely mortified to ever say. And it was when somebody would ask me something like that. Hey, weren't you the guy that squatted 1,000 pounds or whatever? I was like, I used to be. And those words absolutely just tore at my insides until eventually I just had to come to grips with it. And Jiu-Jitsu actually helped a lot with that because it was able to take that energy and put it into a completely different endeavor. And I was never a confrontational person before that point, and I'm still not. As she tells me all the time, I'm way too nice in jiu-jitsu to ever be good at it. But it helped kind of gain a confidence that I didn't know I was lacking as far as being able to have conflict physically and things like that. I was just unskilled. And you never know what's going to happen in a real fight. And, untrained people in fights, they're like children.
Now, how much time elapsed from the time that you stopped powerlifting to jiu-jitsu?
Not quite a year.
So, okay.
Yeah.
All right. So your mobility is probably, so talk me through this, right? Because you have the strength, right? But the technical skill is not there. So that strength will be used against you.
Oh yeah. That, especially the lack of mobility. I mean, the first time we rolled together and she was basically just demonstrating what jiu-jitsu was. I mean, it felt like all the strength that I ever had was a negative because I couldn't use it. She would put me just one small shift in a position, in a control position, and my strength meant absolutely nothing. I couldn't push off the ground. I couldn't push off against my opponent. I couldn't do anything. And then I started figuring out, okay, the application of force is much different than just accumulating it. So learning how to get in better positions and things like that was sport specific skills that carry over into real life if need be, hopefully not.
So then how did that change in your training?
Well, you mentioned mobility.
Yes.
Of course, that's a really big part of jiu-jitsu,
Yes.
being able to get into specific positions. But I fed into that really well because I think, as we mentioned before, my training towards the end of my powerlifting career became much less frequent because the intensities were so crazy relative to my body size. It took a long, long time to recover. So guess what I did in all that other time? I did mobility work because I've always been a huge believer in that, especially for powerlifting or weightlifting or anything. If you don't have the mobility to get into proper technique, and not just to get there, but be secure there and stable there to where you don't have antagonistic tensions from tight muscles that are adding the additional stress to the movement. You're not going to be efficient if you can't hit those positions correctly. And that's what I focus on. I squatted super wide. The only person I was ever able to really relate to in that regard was Laura Phelps. We both squatted crazy wide. She's a little bit shorter than me, but my weights were a little bit higher. And then eventually you get to a point where I can't relate to anybody. And you have to start figuring those things out. And mobility became more and more important there because I needed to get my knees out to almost 180 degrees. I needed to have all these different specialized mobility attributes to compete in the sport. And it carried over to jiu-jitsu really well because I already knew how to do it. I got a little bit smaller and that helped as well. I'll probably still get smaller over time from it. But having the mobility aspects and understanding how to develop it, one, it took a lot of my pains away, back pain, hip pain, that kind of thing. Just not squatting weights with commas in them helped that. But but understanding that side of it, especially as a sports scientist, being able to take those variables and refine them, regardless of what the sport or motorsport is, because I work with drivers too. Understanding the variables there, especially with mobility and those movement patterns and specific to the sport, was a huge, huge benefit in jiu-jitsu.
When you say those variables, the way I've explained this in the past is you kind of got to be old to know what I'm talking about. Remember the old equalizers? They'd have like 10 different levels,
the frequencies,
right? 2 different frequencies. Now, if you pushed them all down, the music sounded like shit. If you pushed them all up, it sounded like shit, right? So you had to find the right balance for whatever music you're playing. Jazz would be different than hard rock, would be different than rap, or whatever it's going to be. And you could set it and have it this perfect setting where I see each one of those levels is, here's absolute strength, say here's dynamic strength, here's mobility, here's flexibility, for all those different things. And if you push all those up, which is impossible to do because you can't train all those mobile, it's distorted. If it's all down, it's distorted. But let's say for a power lifter, the absolute strength is like 9 or 10, the dynamic strength. I'm not going to say it's a 10, right? Because you're not a gymnast, right? But it's 5 or 6, somewhere in that range. Flexibility, probably like 2, right? Mobility, I think it would be seen as a 0. But anyhow, each sport has its own sound, for lack of a better, each that has to be kind of figured out. But all those metrics matter, and they all change over a period of time because as we age, we begin to lose certain attributes from that. And when I started looking at things that way, it's like, okay, shit, the flexibility maybe only needs to be like a 2, but it's a 0 right now, which is hurting the sound. It's distorting the sound, my recovery, my ability to adapt. It's hurting that. So I need to bring that up. But if I bring that up, something else may have to come down, to be able to accommodate for that. Would you kind of agree with what I'm saying here?
Oh yeah, totally. That's a general preparation, right?
Yeah. Yes.
You fix all those issues away from competition, and then you kind of abuse it on the way to competition, because sport and competition specifically is not a health endeavor. It's very much, in a lot of cases, it's a health detriment to some extent.
Oh, yeah.
But getting away from that after the competition's done and trying to fix those issues is core to long-term sustainability.
Well, I think once you get into that post-retirement, if you're just speaking health, right, then it's probably all like a 5.
Sure.
Right? But by going into jiu-jitsu, you get to play with the variables, which...
And jiu-jitsu is great about that because the best athlete is going against another best athlete, and their variables can be completely different. Because technique is obviously going to be a 9, 10 for everybody. But if you are stronger than your opponent, you're going to outdo them. But if your opponent is more flexible than you, you may be able to fold them in half, but they're flexible, so they don't mind being folded in half, and then they can go back to that technique. Or maybe you're strong and they're fast, so you can crush them, but they run away. So that's what I love about jiu-jitsu is that no 2 athletes are exactly the same, but they can both be phenomenal.
So how's that going? All right, now that brings up a bunch of questions, right? Because if it's a single match, like an MMA match, and you know who the opponent's going to be, 12 weeks out, you can train according to what their strengths or weaknesses are. But what if it's a tournament?
So for me personally, my coach, Hanato, he is 56 now, still competing, still amazing. His brackets will usually only have 4 or 5 guys. So he's able to look at all 4 or 5 guys, and they're all the same 4 or 5 guys because these old men have been competing against each other for decades. So he knows how to get ready for each of his guys. But for me, last month, I competed at ADCC North American. My first time to do this particular competition and my second no-gi tournament in a decade. I haven't been doing no-gi. So there's 36 women registered. There's no way I'm going to spend time researching all 36 ladies. So what I did, there were blues and purples registered, which are lower ranks. I didn't look at them. The blacks and the browns that were registered, I looked them up, and I mainly looked at how did they start the matches. Because for me, that's the most important thing. How are we going to get started? Are you going to stand up and you're going to wrestle with me? And are we going to have a good time? Or are you a butt scooter? Are you going to sit down and we've got to deal with that? Because how the match starts is going to dictate a lot of it. Because I want to start on top the entire time. That's why I want to wrestle, because I do not want to start in a detriment. And so if she wants to wrestle, then she's probably got the same mindset. She doesn't want to start in a detriment. So I can have an idea of what her mentality is and what her strength is. And so I can kind of get ready for that. If they're sitting down, it's like, okay, they're probably flexible and fast. They don't want to go head to head. They don't want to bull it out. So I need to, be ready for her to fold herself in half, try to spin under, and just keep her smushed so she can't move. And so that's kind of what I look at, because with a tournament, there's no way to look at all of your opponents in a big bracket.
How do you look at it when you go to a tournament? Because you're a lower level.
My expectations are quite a bit different than hers.
Mhm.
I'm going to tournaments for completely different reasons. She's going to win because somehow or another, at 41, she is still in the prime of her athletic career. How that makes sense, I have no idea. Mine is well behind me, and I'm 37. So that's just one of those things. I don't want to get in her way either, so we don't really do the same competitions on the same day. But when I go to tournaments, it's more, okay, I've accumulated these skills and techniques. We don't get to see that 100% intensity look from a competitor in training. When I go to a tournament, I'm going there hopefully to win, but primarily to further my skill development, figure out where my holes are in my techniques. If someone's got a game that works really well against me, I need to figure out how to defend that. And it's more about skill acquisition and overall development for me because I'm still a purple belt. So it's one of those kinds of things where I'm just going there to learn, hopefully win.
With Jiu-Jitsu, when I said it allows you to still play with the equalizer, is it scratching that itch that was there with the powerlifting? Because when you're engulfed in trying to be the best in the world, you're always looking at all those attributes and how you can fine tune all that. And I think part of the reason people struggle after they retire is because they are trying to just run just this 5 or do bodybuilding stuff. And then they never were training for health in the first place.
Sure.
So a lot just stop training altogether and just go on to something else, where the ones that I've seen that have gravitated towards different skill-based sports of any kind, just the ability to be able to think like what you're doing now allows you to still scratch that itch with those attributes.
Yeah, it's that itch is much, much bigger than just jiu-jitsu though for me. I compete in disc golf. I had to find other competitive outlets. I still compete in Highland games. I might go jump in a traditional golf tournament somewhere, but it takes that many different competitive endeavors, even though I'm not trying to be the best in the world at any of those. I'm trying to improve though. And that journey and the process is what I really love. And I needed something to aim it at because honestly, if I didn't have those endeavors, especially jiu-jitsu and Highland games, it would be incredibly hard for me to still lift weights because it feels like the most mundane thing ever because I know I'm not going to be lifting weights with commas in them anymore. Like what is there to get excited about? I've already hit that pinnacle and everything else. And honestly, part of my motivation is my clients because I know there are tons and tons of people that I've worked with over the years. They don't want to go to the gym, but they need to. It's what's going to fit their goals. And I try to do that kind of to honor them as well, because there's so many days in the gym, and I've made posts about it. It's like, hey, if I didn't have clients, if I didn't have those specific people that I talk to every day and I'm trying to help them improve themselves, like I got to walk the walk too. If I feel like shit or, it doesn't matter. I still need to go because I'm asking these people to do the same thing. And I can't live a life where I'm being a hypocrite in that way, as long as I'm able.
So it gives that push because it's, most days I don't want to train.
Sure.
Right. Yeah. There might be one day per week that I'm kind of like looking forward to.
Yeah.
The rest of them is just, I don't want it. It's just out of habit.
Yeah.
It's like, and that was starting even before I stopped competing. You do something for a long enough period of time, you start figuring out minimum effective dose.
Yes.
It's like, you really start wondering, like, is this sled shit doing anything for me? Right? Because if it's not, I'm not doing it.
Right.
Right. And it's not because of the net result would be greater, which it was, but it was more just because I didn't want to do it.
Right.
So I guess I'll shift that to you. When you've been doing this for so long, how do you navigate that? Because I'm sure you're not waking up every day excited to train.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the reasons why I did ADCC this year. Because for literally the past decade, I've only done gi tournaments. So in the uniform, and ADCC is no gi. So you're just in rash guard and shorts, and you cannot use the uniform against your opponent. So I'm still grappling, but this is kind of a new endeavor for me, because last year for the IBJJF tournaments in my age group, I submitted every single person I went against and had 0 points scored on me the entire season. And so it was just, I basically murdered everybody. And so once I did that, it's like, okay, what's my next challenge? And that's why I decided, okay, I'm going to try ADCC. This is totally, it's like going from powerlifting to Olympic lifting, right? Both of them involve moving weights, but in completely different ways. And so that's how I kind of have kept it alive for me, is switching over to doing the ADCC and trying something a little bit different, a little bit outside of my wheelhouse and a new challenge. And so that's what makes me want to go to class, because it's like, okay, in gi, I know how to do all of this to you. But now I can't take your uniform and wrap it around your head. Now I got to figure out how am I going to make you suffer? But I mean, it really is. I'm now having to learn. I mean, and as a black belt, you're always learning new techniques. But switching over to no gi, I feel like I'm learning a lot of new techniques, a lot of new movements, having to retrain my body to do certain things because I can't rely on the grips. They're not there anymore. So I got to look at different hand positions. And I mean, something as simple as when I grab your gi, I know where you're going to go. But when I grab your wrist, if I grab your wrist with an overhand grip, that's going to control how you pull your hand out versus if I have an underhand grip, right? Are you going to pull your hand this way? Or are you going to pull your hand across your body? Because then that'll open up something else. And so by doing a slightly different version of jiu-jitsu, I'm now learning more things, and I see it as a new challenge. And so that's what's kind of keeping it alive for me.
Going back to the weight cut, which it was your PhD, right?
Yeah.
How would you cut for powerlifting and for what jiu-jitsu?
Yeah.
How should somebody go about cutting weight? Because I know that it's always
No,
let me put some context.
Okay.
We'll go different levels here. A beginner, which probably shouldn't cut it off, but the beginner, right? So how would a beginner go about cutting weight?
Well, when I say it depends, is because which sanctioning body you compete with is going to be different.
Yeah, time.
IBJJF, it's mat side. So you literally step on the scale and go to your ring. So for them, very little weight cut, maybe 2% body weight and water alone. Do not manipulate carbohydrates. Do not manipulate salt, because you've got to go from the scale to a 6 to 10 minute match, depending on your division. So for them, very little. If you're doing ADCC, it's night before. So we can have a lot of fun with that, right? You can cut the water, you can cut the glycogen, you can cut the salt, because you've got almost 24 hours to rehydrate, refuel, and get the salt back in. So depending on where they're at in between that, is it mat side or is it day before? That will dictate, can we cut 2%?
Yeah.
Can we cut all the way up to 7%? So it's just how much time do we have between scale and mat? For jiu-jitsu, that's the main thing I'm looking at.
Well, let's say it is the 7%. What should that look like?
So it's going to be a week-long process, because you're going to start the week ramping up your fluid intake to about 150% of what you're regularly consuming, so that we really ramp up that urine. We're going to keep the salt intake high. We're going to keep carbohydrates kind of where they were. And then when we're about 3 days out, we're going to start to really ramp up the carbohydrate. Or excuse me, we got 7 days. So we're going to start bringing down the carbohydrates, start to deplete the carbohydrate stores. When we're 36 hours out, that's when we cut salt and water, so that we're still producing a lot of urine, but we're not holding fluid. And then we hit the scale. And then once you've hit the scale, then we're going to start rehydrating with a basically watered down Gatorade, very light carbohydrate, sodium drink of some kind, and start getting that into your system to start rehydrating. And then start eating small snacks right after you weigh in, and then about every hour to 2 hours, depending on what your stomach can tolerate, so you can start building back up those glycogen stores. And the electrolytes, the watered down Gatorade, is really important, because some athletes will weigh in and they start slamming water. You're low on sodium. You're at a high risk of hyponatremia at that point. So you need to have sodium and some carbohydrates in that water, so that you're not putting yourself at risk as you rehydrate.
You can't use IVs?
We don't know. No, I don't think it's allowed by our sanctioning bodies.
So it's not that much different than what the powerlifter would be, with the exception of maybe the IVs, coming in after.
Like a full 24-hour weigh-in where you're weighing at 9 a.m. and then you go compete at 9 a.m. the next day is completely different. The risk factors are a lot different too. So powerlifters can get away with cutting a lot more, because like in MMA, if you're dehydrated, you have a much higher tendency to get knocked out. It doesn't take near as much because of the cerebrospinal fluid and how much the brain moves inside the skull. Anytime I have people with this jiu-jitsu, powerlifting, weightlifting, whatever, if the weigh-in time is closer to competition time, I'll try to have people do the process she just outlined, but do the sweating the night before, to where we can get hopefully a little bit under the weight class and then start eating and then having electrolytes. Because if you can have carbs the night before, when you haven't had them leading up to that, your sleep quality is immensely better. And your glycogen uptake into the muscles is stored so much better compared to trying to have it for breakfast the next day. So those variables are the main things that change for me with short-term weigh-ins to 24-hour weigh-ins.
On the topic of what I would consider auto-regulation, right, which is an acquired skill over a period of, say, a decade of training. Like you go into the gym, you may not feel like going to the gym. You're making all these micro decisions, you know, from the time you walk in to how you warm up to what the warm up weights are and to the top sets. Maybe there isn't going to be a top set that day. Maybe it's going to be regressed. With how can somebody fast track that process? Because in hindsight, an elite lifter or elite athlete can look back and, you know, if it's not there, it's not there. It doesn't mean you're going to stop, but you might, right? It's your own internal feedback. But as coaches, you have to navigate people to kind of learn what that all means. RPE becomes kind of a weird thing, you know, when you see that prescribed, but like, what the fuck is an 8.5 mean to you, to me, to her? You know, so that becomes obsolete really quick, if not unnecessary from the very beginning. But knowing what it should feel like for that day matters, and then being able to make decisions on that matters, not just for that day, but how it will impact the next training day and how you're going to be able to recover from that. So when you're working with clients, and this will probably be a higher skilled level client, how do you help them navigate those, I guess, micro decisions?
I try to break things down to feeling, because in my opinion, a good coach has had to live that life to some extent, to where you don't just know the nuts and bolts of it. You don't just know how to program or write a diet or whatever. You know what it feels like. So when you're able to work with any client really, but especially higher level clients, and you say, okay, I need you to do this workout. The next day, you're probably going to feel like this in these certain areas. 2 days after that, you're going to do this training session and you should feel this way after that. And when they start seeing that pattern, you can actually call those shots because you lived it. You did it for a decade, like you said. You put in your 10,000 hours. Their belief in what you do grows exponentially. And that actually helps their motivation and their confidence as well. So it lowers stress levels. They have better recovery curves too. So being able to communicate those things because you've had the experience, you gained the wisdom, is incredibly important.
Yeah, same. Yeah, basically being able to, tell your athlete what they should be feeling. And since I've worked with a lot of clients that are coming in with health conditions and things like that, I'll be very conservative with their first few training cycles. And, when they're in their fail week and it's actually ended up being like 25, 30 reps because we were so low in the beginning, then I can start talking to them like, okay, during fail week, how did you feel? Right. And then when we get into training cycle number 3, we're like, okay, I want you to have this level of intensity that you felt during fail week of the first training cycle, and that way just kind of gradually ease them in. This is assuming they have no training. I'm taking, again, that grandma, her first time, right? Those first couple training cycles, they're going to be very high rep, very low weight, because we want her to feel what it feels like to lift weights, what it feels like to push yourself to that end point safely. If she's doing 30 reps and that gets her the 1 rep from failure, there's a very low risk of her dropping that weight and hurting herself. And that's what I want during those first few training cycles, because then we get the feeling of what it's like to lift weights and what it feels like to get close to failure. And then we can start adjusting the weights and lifting heavier weights to get closer to failure sooner, because you don't want to jump into that too soon, especially with those older, untrained athletes, because their risk of injury is so high.
All right, guys, this is how I use my element packs. I got a few different ways that I use it. So currently just got done training. So post training, I will mix one of the chocolate. This is the chocolate caramel and my oatmeal. I'm more of a half packet guy. So I put about a half a packet in there and then stir it around. Then it adds that salty chocolate taste to it. If for some reason I'm using chocolate protein in my oatmeal, then I won't put that in there. I'll put a half pack in my coffee, which I'm not going to do now, but the chocolate mocha is really good in the coffee. And then for training, when I trained earlier today, it's simply, my favorite is the grapefruit salt. Pretty much just a half pack in there, and then kind of reseal the packs and then put them in. And then, so for training, I'll have a half a pack and then half a pack in the oatmeal. So it's about a pack a day. If I'm sweating really bad during training, then I might use a full pack in there. But the go-to for me is the oatmeal because it's an everyday thing. The way I was introduced to ChiliPad a few years ago was, a friend of mine, when we were talking and we're kind of joking around, the whole premise of the conversation was how hot, we sleep. And then he noted that he was using, this ChiliPad mattress cover. And it took me less than a day to go order the one that I was using. Worked phenomenally well. So what it helped me with was falling asleep faster because I'm not sweating all night long, and then staying asleep. It helped with that as well. So overall sleep hygiene, it made a substantial difference with me, which is why I'm excited that ChiliPad is partnering with us, because it's a product that I've used for so long. Visit sleepme.com/Table Talk to get your ChiliPad and save up to $315 with the code Table Talk. This offer is available exclusively for Table Talk listeners and only for a limited time. Order it today with free shipping and try it out for 30 days. You can return it for free if you don't like it with their sleep trial. Visit www.sleep.me/Table Talk, because you're not investing in better sleep, you're creating a better life. www.sleep.me/Table Talk.
I narrowed my search down to 3 different companies, all made nice equipment, all had nice accessories, but by far and away, elitefts had the best customer service. And honestly, the best prices too. There were a few things that I wanted for this facility that weren't already being done by elitefts. And when I asked Matt, I said, would you be able to do this? He said, not a problem. I will make any piece you want, any dimension you want, any color we want, even if it's not already in your catalog. So once he said that, was able to follow through on that and give us a very high quality product on time at a price that was better than any of their competitors. It was a no-brainer for me.
Okay, so jumping back into this, we'll go into, I have a couple notes here, like the hedgehog thing. You got to explain that to me.
So the initial hedgehog was just a whim. We were we were in Vegas one year for Worlds, and I don't remember if I saw an ad for a hedgehog or I don't know, but I was just like, I want a hedgehog. So as soon as we got back to Kansas, I actually found a hedgehog rescue. And so I rescued this hedgehog. Her name was Holly. She was full of hate and rage. She lived about a year longer than hedgehogs are supposed to. And I'm pretty sure it's because she was just so mad at the world that she would not pass on. And then when Holly passed away, the rescue contacted me. They needed emergency rescues. They had 2 different litters of hedgehogs that needed immediate rehoming. So I took on 2 more hedgehogs and had them for about a year. And then I convinced a friend of mine that his daughter needed them.
I'm completely ignorant when it comes to hedgehogs.
Yeah.
Are they nocturnal?
Yes, they're nocturnal. And they are not nice. They are basically like a hamster with quills. Like, because you see the Instagram and the movies and you're like, oh, these things are so cute. They are cute, but like Holly, when you would go to pick, because you got to bathe them once a week and you got to trim their nails. So you got to handle them so they're used to being handled. But that little turkey, when I would reach into her cage to get a hold of her, she would jump into me, quills first, and stab me in the hand because she was a booger.
Yeah.
And then the 2 we rescued, we called them Dude and Walter off of The Big Lebowski because Dude was cool. He was actually one of those fun hedgehogs that you probably see on an Instagram account. Walter would bite you every single time. And so you got a hold of this guy and you're trying to bathe him and he's biting you. And you can't like shake him off because, they're tiny. They'll die if you throw them. So
Yeah.
you got to hold on to Walter while he's biting you and just wait for him to
wait.
let you go. Yeah.
I had a roommate in college that had a skunk, right? So, and it was nocturnal.
Yeah.
Could never find this thing ever. And it's a 2-bedroom apartment. You would think you couldn't find it ever. But at night, you know, it'd be tearing the shit out of everything and shitting in the bathtub and all kinds of stuff. I don't know how long it lasted. It was several months or whatever it was. But what was just boggling to me is I would literally take time. Like, I'm going to find this. I can't remember the name of the stupid thing right now. I'm going to find this damn thing just to see what it's doing. Like, where is it?
Yeah.
I could never. And it was a fairly big, obviously it was distinct or whatever they call that.
Yeah, they take the glands out. Right?
Yeah. And I think his thought was, this would be a great pet. It's never did anything. So just tear the shit apart and eat cereal out of the cabinets.
Yeah.
Crap like that.
They're just like a painted possum pretty much.
Yeah. Yes. With all the athletes that you've worked with, which are the ones that you've liked working with most? Not saying that you don't like working with everybody.
Yeah. For me, it doesn't really have a lot to do with what level of athleticism they have or their competition endeavors or anything like that. My goal as a coach, even from day one, like I enjoy the high elite athletics part, but sometimes it's even boring because it's easy. Because you're dealing with really gifted people who a lot of times have work ethic already, or they're so gifted that doesn't come into play as much.
Mm-hmm.
And then they can be kind of a pain in the butt. But the people who I can really help them improve their quality of life, that's the biggest thing in the world to me as a coach. I don't care what you're trying to do, whether you're trying to go to the Olympics or just get up off the toilet so you can go play with the grandkids. If I can help you help yourself have a much better quality of life, like a percent change. Like one of the best stories that I'd ever had was a lady who came into the gym crying when I was real young in the training game. And I thought somebody died. She looked that upset, but she was happy because she was able to stand up and put her pants on for the first time in a decade. And when you can have that big of an impact on somebody's life, because you're not doing the work, you can kind of aim them at doing the work and suggest things that they should do. But when you're able to play a role in somebody's life, improving that much, that's all I really care about. And that can go down every single avenue, whether it's, children's athletics, elderly people, top athletes, worst athletes in the world. It doesn't matter because I want to give people that feeling.
Mm-hmm.
Same boat. Like my favorite clients are usually my postpartums or my grandmas because their whole reason for getting back into shape is to keep up with the new person in their life. And so just to be able to help them be able to keep up with the grandkids, run around with the grandkids. Plus you get lots of baby pictures, which is always fun. With the moms, it's getting them back into their bodies because right after they deliver they don't feel like themselves. They're going through a lot of emotional stuff. They've now got this new big responsibility, and so to be able to help them with the nutrition and fitness part and take that stress out of their life so they can focus on the new things in their life is very rewarding. And with the grandmas, some of them I'm putting them into physical shapes they've never been in before. Like I've got this one long-term client, she's been with me, I think we're going on 4 years now. And so I've gotten to see her grandkids grow up, but she started out just wanting to keep up with them. And now like she is a strong grandma. Like she is putting up some numbers. So she probably beat up all the other grandmas at the park. Mm-hmm. And that's my favorite. I like the athletes. Obviously one of my athletes I'm working with right now, he said if he wins worlds, he's going to tattoo my silhouette on him. So I really hope he wins. But yeah, just like Derek said, being able to help people improve their quality of life, because that's really the longevity thing. As an athlete, we're eventually going to have to retire, but when your quality of life improves, that's forever. That's never going to stop. So when I can teach them habits that are going to make them happy forever, that's really rewarding.
So if I take and look at longevity,
mm-hmm.
So there's the definition that you just put out there, but the question for both you guys would be the longevity of the competitive career.
Yeah.
Right. Because you're still in it, right?
Mm-hmm.
At 41.
Yeah.
Right. So that's extending the longevity of a competitive career beyond
mm-hmm.
what most would. And that's going to be different than whatever general definition we wanted to put behind longevity, which is something I don't really get, because quality of life should be more than longevity, because we can get hit by a car tomorrow. Right. So the live longer thing doesn't really resonate very well with me. I don't really get that.
Yeah.
Live better makes more sense to me.
Yeah.
Being alive is not living.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So go into that. Explain that.
Well, if you don't have something that makes you enjoy your life, just because you exist and you haven't passed away yet doesn't mean that you're having a good life. You have to have some kind of endeavor, whether it's your kids, grandkids, or some goal that you're going after. You have a business that you really enjoy running, just something that gives you purpose, something that causes you to invest into your life and go through struggle, because struggle is what gives things meaning and value over time. So the most common thing that I hear people say, especially when I was still competing, my mom was classic for this. It's like, don't you know that you're just going to hurt when you get old? I'm like, doesn't everybody hurt when they get old? You may as well have a damn good reason why I'm hurting versus just not having a reason. I guess I'm just old.
Well, the one thing that you said in there that I think is valuable is, with that purpose has to have struggle.
Yes.
Where, to me, it seems most of the people I'm speaking to are trying to figure out all the different ways they can to mitigate struggle. And as we should, right? I mean, you don't want to do stupid shit all the time, but whatever that objective is should have struggle associated with that. But to back down to the longevity of the athlete's career, there's different chapters in life, right? So let's just make that assumption there too. Like, the career is going to end, but there's two ways it can end. One, the sport takes you out.
Yes.
One, you decide that you're done with the sport. One, catastrophic injury, we have no real control. We have control over that more than what people think. I'll let you talk about that a little bit, because most will say that you don't have any control over that catastrophic thing. I disagree, and I think you're kind of on the same. Yep. So validate why you feel that way.
Well, that's one of the things that I always heard a lot when I got into powerlifting. It was like, go to a meet, and it wasn't a good meet unless you saw somebody's bicep roll up to their shoulder. So you were expecting all those things. But as I got more educated in sports science and started understanding variables that are behind injury risk, there's always risk for injury. Whether you're stepping on the platform, trying to lift whatever, or you're just walking out in the street, there's risk. Always. So things are going to happen, but you can control the percentage of that risk and your risk factors to a very large degree through good technique, mobility, and being able to manage your fatigue. High fatigue is one of the biggest causes, especially for non-contact injuries in field sports. And if you are overtrained, your muscles are literally in a poor state, and they have a much higher tendency to tear. If you're constantly dehydrated, all your tissues, all soft tissues, whereas connective, meniscus, cartilage, the actual contractile tissue, all those things have a higher risk of tearing. So you can control so many of those factors through fatigue management and proper hydration and nutrition and all those things, periodizing and waiving your intensities to make sure you recover. There's so many things that are under your control that you can really minimize your injury risk. And I was lucky enough to figure that out pretty early.
How would you define overtrained? And I put that out there because how many people have told us, oh, I'm overtrained?
Sure.
And they very well could be undertrained, so how would you define overtrained?
Yeah. Feeling tired and sore is not being overtrained for sure. You would need to have that state happen consistently, and you continue to train on top of that for quite a while before you get into a major detriment to where a lot of times people recover from being overtrained because they tweak something and they're forced to step away because they can't perform. It's like the unintentional deload.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I had many of those.
Yeah. Yeah. We all did.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I was lucky enough not to have the catastrophic ones. And I learned early, a lot of times because it was my joints that were giving out first. But as I was able to recover from that, it would be a subluxation of the shoulder, not a full dislocation, but I could be dumbbell pressing. My shoulder would just kind of pop in and out of place, especially when I was smaller. And I would have to take time away from pressing, but it also kept me from overtraining to a certain extent as well. And then I started really seeing how that happens over time and how you can manage it. And it was like, wait a minute, I don't have to train like I'm being recorded for a bodybuilding DVD every single time I go into the gym. You're not screaming and losing your mind in every session. And when you start figuring those things out, then you start seeing it happen to other people. And it's like, that was probably more preventable than they think it is. And then you hear, especially a lot of older coaches say, well, it's just part of the sport. It's like, well, sure, but not to that degree.
Yeah.
It's not just inevitably going to happen. There are a lot of factors that go into it.
One thing that provided a lot of clarity for me on that, it unfortunately was more towards the back end of my career.
As it happens, right?
Is my wife and I went on a 10-day cruise. And of course, I'm freaking about this because it's 7 weeks out from a meet. It's just, I'm pissed because she planned it the wrong time. You know how all that kind of goes.
Exactly.
But you're going anyhow. And obviously there's just machines and shit on the cruise. And my shoulder was killing me before I left. I mean, like fucked up bad. So I leave and I come back, and then the first day back, and it was at Westside, so it's max ever. The first 2 weeks, I'm breaking PRs by like 30, 40 pounds. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, like I'm literally trying to find if there's an island somewhere that we're going to land on that I can go and have somebody put my squat shit on, and it's to that, what I'm talking about, it's to that extent. Then I come back and I'm like, what the fuck? Like, wait a minute, like, is this necessary to do this shit every week?
Right.
Or would there be some mitigating factors to kind of play into that? And right after that, it was like, oh, okay. There's something going on here. I think I just got used to being beat down.
Right.
And then you don't really know, because after the meet, you're going to take time down. And then, other variables change. So when you come back, you're not going to be as strong as when you were before. So it didn't like slap me in the face like that did.
Right.
Because at that point, I'm thinking the other side of that is, fuck it. I'm only training once every 2 weeks and that's it. Yeah. I'm not doing anything else. And, but that mitigating the fatigue plays into everything you just said. The mobility is what plays into increasing the longevity of that competitive career. And if somebody can get ahead of that,
oh man,
before most, right? Because for most, they get in young and you can pretty much get away with anything.
Sure.
When you're in 20 to 25 or a teenager, and it's crazy, right? Because everything that you do that's kind of stupid kind of gets you to a higher level. Then when you're at the higher level, you think that's what you need to do. But what you need to do is the complete opposite. Of that. It's like, so now I need to train less. Like, what the hell? Yeah,
your window of being able to get away with things slowly starts creeping in. And if you have an injury, it abruptly gets smaller.
Yes.
So
now, would you say that if somebody, say, is a genetic freak and boom, they hit that window, they get there fast, like at 23, they can still get away with it, right? But they shouldn't. Right. Actually, no, they won't be able to get away with it, because once you get to a certain level, it's really, really hard, to move up past that level, where when they get stagnant, I think that's where a lot will quit as well. Right. Because they'll get in there, they get stagnant, even if they're younger, because they got there so fast. Right. But they got there using basically any method that would allow them to be able to get there. Where they could extend that if they learned more about training. Yeah.
I felt in retrospect, after I had retired and had a lot of time to think about it, I think I was pretty lucky in that regard, because I didn't have any like real crazy genetic gifts. I had good genetics for sure. Like none of this could have happened without good genetics, but people who have great genetics, like world-class genetics, I came from a town of 1,000 people. There were people in my town that had the physical attributes and those genetic gifts. They could have gone to the NFL, but they didn't have either mental attributes. They didn't have the drive, for whatever reason. When things would get hard, because it was so easy to make so much progress and be better than everybody else, that they didn't really value it. I don't think they valued the process. And I was just shitty enough to really value the process over time, because things had to get refined and I had to make modifications and I had to educate myself to continue making progress so that I could actually be effective and competitive where I wanted to be. And I feel like if I was just superiorly genetically gifted at the beginning of it, one, you don't really get to learn what's supposed to work and what's supposed to not work. and the risk factors that are all involved with that. So you don't get as much of an education on things going wrong.
Do you feel the mental drive is genetic?
Yeah, there are definitely genetic factors to that, for sure. The conditions that you grow up in environmentally as well, the people that you're around. And yeah, I mean, there's so many psychological variables at play there. There are immense, but it all manifests in different ways for different people.
How have you gone about increasing the competitive longevity?
So, I sustained a lot of injuries because I was training. Some of it was training improperly. Some of it, I'm a female, so I've had 3 ACL surgeries, but I've also had 2 back surgeries, and both of those came from just not regulating who my training partners were, not training safely, having that mentality that I had to fight everyone. And so the big guys that didn't want to get beat by a girl, that's how I hurt my back. And so as I've gotten older and maybe a little bit more wiser, is picking your training partners that are safe. And I think that can be related to any sport, you know, with weightlifting, right? Picking a weight that's appropriate for what you're trying to do. So for me, it's picking an opponent, a training partner, whatever rounds that is appropriate for what I'm trying to achieve. I'm not trying to be the baddest person in the world anymore. I still want to win every tournament, but you know, I don't have to beat the 20-year-olds that are full of piss and vinegar. It's fine. Those guys can do whatever they want. So it's that training smarter, figuring out what are you trying to achieve and how can I safely get there is a big thing for me. And fatigue management is huge. The other gym that I was at before I moved to North Carolina, there was not a lot of taking rest rounds. There was not low training days. Every day was come in and kill. And I've come to North Carolina, and Coach Piper is really good about what intensity do you want to go today? Like, we have specific comp classes, and then we have other days where he'll come over to me like, no, you're not rolling with them. You're going to go over here. You're going to, you know, kind of reining me in a little bit, which is really nice to have. And the same thing when I go down to Florida, my coach down there, he will pick who I'm rolling with to help keep me safe, to keep me at the intensity that he knows I need to be at to get to the competition, right? So he won't have me train with the black belts every single day. I'll come in, and some days he'll pair me up with blues and purples because I need a lower training day. And I'm still in the athlete mindset, so I still need a babysitter. I need someone to pull me back and be like, this is what you need to do. Because I can tell my clients that, but I still need somebody to come in and pull me back.
Well, one thing I noticed after I retired and had sponsors and, you know, watching all you guys competing was when you're looking at the lifters at that top level, the one that came in the least beat up was normally the one that won. Right. And we're talking about differences in total of maybe 300 pounds. But if somebody's coming in and they're just trashed, they get beat by the one that's not as trashed. Keep in mind, I'm not saying that anybody went in totally healthy, because there's accumulated, you know, issues that are going to happen from that. But being able to observe, like from an outsider in, you know, like this is like the first time I was like, why did this happen? Right. Because you know everybody's numbers before it. It's like, and like, wait a minute, like, why did it then repetitively over a period of time? It became more, the advice I'd be giving people is, I don't really care what you do, you know, peaking for the meet, just be the least beat up. And then you'll be able to display the strength that you actually have. You know, because probably true in any sport, what you display on that day is usually going to be under what you're usually capable of, which means what you're really capable of needs to always keep going up to be able to pull up what you're actually capable of.
Definitely. How many meets did you have personally where it seemed like everything leading up to it in the last month or two was just absolute shit, and then you end up having a good day?
Pretty much all. all the good meets I had were that. You know, and you know, how many meets did I have where I could say, you know, there was a PR on the third attempt, you know, all the way across, and won. You know, and something that Ed Cohen said to me one time that kind of resonated too is when we're talking about, you know, your true 100%. Like what this is where it gets weird with RPE and all the different, even percentages and stuff like that. It gets all weird. Like, what is that? You know, because if you squat at 1050, but let's say it was a misload and you could have done 1075, is that 100% really 1050? And then, you know, it's not going to be that a month later. So we were talking about what is that true 100%? Well, that's the squat that you do that you barely do.
Yes.
Like if one more pound was on that. Now, I think I asked, like, how many times did you experience that with each lift? Is like,
Oh yeah.
once, twice was an actual 100% effort, which becomes for me fascinating, because what do you program off of?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And that's where that daily, regular auto regulation, all the other, having a coach that knows what they're doing.
Yeah.
That's kind of where all those kind of things fall into there. Because the other thing with skill acquisition is it's not really linear. If it was, we'd all be benching thousands of pounds.
Right.
There's ebbs and flows. In a squat, you can bring somebody in and fix their technique, and it kind of locks in for them. Then they hit a 50-pound PR. Did they get 50 pounds stronger? No. Depends how you want to define stronger, I suppose. But no, they were able to display their strength better. In jiu-jitsu, it'd be the same with the skill. If they lock in and really get another skill, the performance can go through the roof till somebody figures out how to use that against them. And those ebbs and flows are what I think a lot of athletes are not wrapping their head around, because they can, and where coaches are valuable, because that may happen halfway through a training phase or a peaking phase. All of a sudden you fixed one thing, then everything's going better. Do you A, increase the load, expecting a higher output, or B, stay with the plan, on what it is? And there's no right answer for that, and those, I would say if I'm to tell somebody what the right answer it is, it would be stay with the plan, right? Yeah. Unless you have a coach to be able to help navigate that. With your own training, did you see things like that for both of you, that, you're going at this linear pace, and then skill acquisition peaks or whatever it is, and boom, here's this other level. Then you're kind of in this weird spot, especially if you're educated and aware of what's going on.
Yeah.
Because you can increase the load or whatnot, and maybe get away with it. But as you do that, you're also increasing the work capacity, which your body is not accustomed to, which can have, a negative impact on later. Did you run into things like that?
Tons. Yeah. And I have to explain this to my clients almost on a daily basis, because they'll get frustrated with a bad gym day or something like that. I'm like, well, look, that 100% hypothetical strength that you could exude, it changes not just day by day, but hour by hour. Like if I'm sitting here for several hours, my squat workout later on is not going to be as good as if it was and I didn't do this and I just did some mobility and whatever. So you have to take everything into context. And a big part of it is understanding the variables that you cannot control and you don't know, because there's so many things we don't know about this process. We don't have even ways to measure the variables that we haven't found yet. And a lot of the variables we have found, we can't accurately measure those either. So understanding that we give the best effort, like you go to competition, you try to give your best odds of performing well. You don't have complete control over it. There could be a difference in a bearing in one of the barbells that throws something off, especially in Olympic weightlifting. If there's an older bearing in a bar, not like a brand new bar or something, it's not spinning well, that's going to change how much you can lift, even if your force and power outputs are higher than ever. I went through that a lot in powerlifting. It got towards the end of my career, like the last 5 years. My number one priority, aside from money, trying to win some money, was looking at the equipment that they were going to have at the meets. Because if I didn't have a 30 kilo or a 65, 66 pound squat bar, I couldn't hardly do anything, because I was so narrow underneath the bar, because I'd get wedged in so tight, my hands would be next to my shoulders, just so I could maintain stability in my spine to squat correctly. That if I squatted with a 55 pound bar, that thing whipped all over the place. And it didn't just put me at risk for missing the lifts, it endangered the people around me. So half the time I was going to professional meets just so I knew I had really good equipment to use. So just small variables like that, the carpet that's on the platform. The guys at the XPC were nice enough to move the mono one day at the Arnold. Like they moved it back 3, 4, 5 feet. Adam Driggers actually helped me convince them to do that, because there was a dip in the platform and the carpet was loose, and we just scooted over to a little bit better place. But I mean, so many little things like that. Like the first 1,000-pound squat that I ever did, my shoes blew out. How do you account for that? I mean, the threading outside of my heel on one of my shoes blew out, and I tried to go unrack 1060 after that on my third attempt. And like, I just couldn't stand up with it because my shoe wasn't working. So there's so many things that are completely out of your control to a certain extent. You know, the universe has a funny way of dealing with you sometimes, and you just have to accept that and move on.
How would this manifest through your training?
So when thinking about sticking with your plan, even when you like have those huge spikes in performance, what I think about is like when I'm getting ready for tournaments, and you'll have a day where you're just on fire, like everything is clicking, you're moving really well, and so you're like, oh, I'm feeling great, I should take on this guy over here and this guy. Like, say it's a day where I'm supposed to be going against moderate level people, but I'm on fire and I feel like I should go and take on the toughest guys in the gym. Stick with the plan, because the day before I took on the toughest guys, I need to recover from that. Yeah, today I'm having an on fire day, and that's awesome. Capitalize on the technique, keep everything crisp, but stick with the plan, stick with the intensity you're supposed to be at, because if I do 2 back-to-back super hard training days, I'm going to be wrecked. And then my risk of injury is going to be greater throughout the rest of the week, and it could hinder my training as the week progresses. And so enjoy those times when you're a stud and you're feeling it. Enjoy it. Focus in on all the little details, because that's the time to really make stuff crisp, when you're just on fire. Because we have those days where it's just like everything is just clicking. It's a great day. Enjoy it. Enjoy the feel, but stay with the plan. Stick with what you're supposed to do that day and do those exercises. If it's lifting or if it's jiu-jitsu, do it to max capacity in terms of what you're supposed to do that day.
All right. Now, the reverse of that would be the bad days.
Just take your lumps. I've had more of those days. I mean, I was talking with one of the blue belts, and he's kind of at a plateau right now where he thinks he's regressing. He's really not. It's just he's been training with us so much, we all know his game, so we can shut it down. And so it's that time where it's like, you got to recognize some days are going to suck. Some months are going to suck. So, you know, there's times when it's going to suck, and you got to get through it, and you got to think about, why does it suck? And so, like, I was talking with this guy, it's like, it sucks right now because we all know your game. You've got to start adding in more moves. You've got to start adding in new techniques, because we know exactly what you're going to do, and we can shut it down. And as a black belt, that's the same thing. There's still so much for me to learn. And so it's, you know, when you're in those phases where it's like, okay, this sucks. If it sucks multiple days on end, does it suck because you're overtrained? Does it suck because you're making the same mistake? You know, what's going on? Something is leading to this. Can you identify what it is? Can you correct it?
Jiu-Jitsu is so tough with that, because I guess it's similar to powerlifting. If you've got consistent training partners over many, many, many years, everyone is making progress, hopefully, right? And you're all kind of paralleling each other in that rate. So the guys that started a few years before you can't quite really catch them most of the time if you're equal, like athleticism and things like that. And it feels like, God, I'm just wasting my time. I'm not going anywhere, because the same guys are still beating me and I'm still beating the same people, but you're all on a rising tide, and it's bringing up all the ships all at once. And then when somebody new comes in, and then a white belt who's been in jiu-jitsu for 6 months absolutely tools them up. It's like, oh, wait, man, they're not that ignorant little person flailing around on the mat anymore with no idea what's going on. So it's hard to keep perspective that way, especially if your group's small and you're not exposed to a lot of other people. I imagine you saw that quite a bit in your career training.
What I also saw, though, was if it says the white belt powerlifter that comes in, they grow at exceedingly high rates.
Sure.
When they're around other people that know what they're doing.
Oh yeah.
You know, far greater to the point where I would advise people now, you know, you can have somebody create the best program for you and track every metric and auto-regulate everything you need to do and train alone, and compare that to training with people that know what they're doing. That person is always going to beat the other.
Sure.
Always. Just because there's so many things, just environmentally, you know, and the things we can't measure that play into this, that come into play if you're training around people with the right mindset, can see things different ways. Where, I mean, if you go deep into the weeds, just on a max squat or a max set of squats, you can approach that with a confident mindset. You can approach it with a mindset that's not confident. So, but still do it anyhow, because this is what you do. Now, neurally, you know, how, and even physically, and you know, how is that? You're going to recover differently from that same weight.
Oh yeah.
You know, just because of the mindset that's associated with that, right? And that there, you know, that's where the complexity and the weeds and all that other kind of shit is just kind of fascinating, you know, to me, because all that plays into this. And when you have people, and the stronger group's going to have subconsciously higher expectations.
Sure.
You may still be giving the guy shit and all this other kind of stuff. You know, it's just kind of part of the whole thing. But when they go into a gym and, you know, a 400-pound bench is not a big bench and they're only benching 225.
Yeah.
You know, getting into 400 is not going to be the same path as somebody that's going into a gym where the biggest bench there might be 185.
Yeah.
You know, so it's those variables, I believe, can be controlled by just finding people and coaches to be able to work with, be able to help that.
Standards of execution and things like that.
Yeah. Were there any topics you guys wanted to go over I didn't bring up?
Well, kind of on that same note where you're talking about the environment being so important, the things that really seem to change in my experience, and I'd love to get your feedback on this, being West Side for so long and then just having high intensity training for a long time, is there's so much intuitively correct by people who have been around for a long time. Because just being around for a long time means that you have a certain level of success. You've been able to avoid certain pitfalls. But when I see people in powerlifting who tend to improve quickly, like you said, than one of the beginners, being around experienced people, they have much better lifting intent. Their technique gets better because they have better coaching in general. They have people in their ear constantly. But I feel like the actual intent behind the lift of executing every single rep to a higher degree of efficiency and intensity versus someone that's training by themselves, or they don't have a training group that has higher expectations. They're just kind of there, the recreational mindset. Would you say that lifting intent is what drives most of those results?
Yeah, but I would add to that the technical efficiency, and that probably does fall into the intent. With intent, I'm thinking of the force, you know, being applied.
Yeah,
because I do think that increases too, you know, with that. But with that group, you know, the technical coaching is going to begin with the bar, you know, with everything, you know, as it goes up, and the cueing and whatnot associated with that. The exceptions to that would be people like Blaine Sunner, Mike Touche are two that come to mind. But when you look at them, and when I interviewed them and kind of got into the weeds with that, both of these guys were filming every lift that they did from 3 different angles and then reviewing. Like, you know, an NFL player would review game film, you know, so there's ways to counter that, because there's always been top competitors that, you know, trained alone by themselves and so forth.
Sure.
But I don't know how to answer the question when you exclude outliers. I mean, if you exclude outliers, then yes, of course, you know, with the group 100%, but you put in the outliers and the ones that are going to be filming at 3 different angles and all this other stuff. A lot today will film from one angle, you know, and they're filming for a different reason, you know, for social media or whatever's going
to get the likes.
Yeah. Then, and maybe they are, I mean, a lot are filming it to be able to look, you know, when just a couple of weeks ago when I was in Myrtle, I'm watching somebody benching, you know, doing their bench work and filming every set. And I'm seeing things that are, you know, off, right? And the person would film it, look, you know, open it, and go do exactly the same thing again, right? And, you know, I'm sitting there, I'm like, is it ignorance? Did they not know? I mean, they're glaring, like overextending, you know, stuff like, you know, things that they should know.
Right.
And so I'm starting to question, like, what's the point of the filming? You know, or is it ignorance? And I'm not the type of person that's going to say, hey, do this. If they'll ask, I'll, you know, more, yes, 100%. Now, if they're doing something that's going to hurt them, yeah, of course, you know, but I'm not going to be that guy that's going to go and say, hey, you know, do this, you know, with that. But it was intriguing to me because obviously it wasn't being filmed, you know, for Instagram or social media. It was being filmed because every set, you know, was being filmed. And so technology can help, you know, and should help, but you need to be able to know what you're actually looking at,
Yeah, that was probably the single most impactful thing I ever did for my training, was starting to video myself. Because if you don't, there is a potential very large difference between what you feel is happening and what is happening subjectively in real life. And you see that play out a lot with squat depth. And that was the first reason I started videoing, is exactly from the side judge's perspective. Where am I at? Because if my muscles are tight one day, it'll feel like I hit parallel when I'm 2 inches above.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm extra mobile, I've made increases in that kind of like hamstring or adductor flexibility, where I feel like I'm at parallel might be 1 to 2 below. And that's where I started putting those things together. But without videoing myself and taking the link between what I felt was happening, which is proprioception, 10-cent word at parties to make it sound cool, and then actually seeing it and then bridging that gap. Okay, this is what actually happened. This is what I thought happened. So now when I feel this, it should look like this. And then you start understanding the variables that change perception, not just training adaptations and progressions and all that stuff, but it actually colors the lens that you view everything through. Then you start really getting a hold on a lot of different variables that other people don't. To me, that was competitive advantage.
Yeah. Any topics that you wanted to go over I didn't bring up?
I don't think so.
Puppies, kitties.
Yeah, so outside of the hedgehog, what other pets?
So right now we've got 2 pit bulls, which are his dogs. We got a Lhasa Apso and a Pekingese. The Pekingese runs the house, all 12 pounds over. And then 2 orange cats. So we'd have more, but somebody's killjoy.
Having 6 animals in the house is a little much to me. And I'm allergic to cats, which she didn't believe when we first started dating. So she took me to a flipping cat show
Turns
just
out
to
he's
see what would
allergic.
happen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what happened?
My face swelled up.
Like
Oh, that's
literally,
great.
we step into the place where the cat show's at. I get our tickets. I turn to hand him his ticket, and he's all ready. And so that's when I knew he wasn't lying. And I was like, we can leave, but
Yeah.
he trooped through it.
Yeah, we did not leave.
Yeah.
And I just suffered through. I remember looking at this cat and I'm like, oh yeah, that's a nice cat. It's a real nice cat. Yeah.
So what did you use to counter that, to paybacks?
Do you think I can give her paybacks at all?
Well, that's why I asked, right? Because
That's an interesting concept. I'll have to come up with something one day.
I don't know if you see his ring. It says Uki for life.
Yeah.
He is
Mhm.
my practice dummy for life.
Oh.
He put it on. He signed up. He just has to take my torment.
Yeah.
So
All right. Well, how can people find you?
I'm on Instagram at Dr. Jiu-Jitsu.
And I'm at Wilcox Strength Inc. on Instagram. You can go to wilcoxstrengthinc.com as well. That site is in early processes of being built up, and we'll have lots of fun projects on there in the future.
Any new PhDs in the future? Or are you guys like,
Nah, I think I'm done with school. So
Yeah.
mainly just focusing on still want to win more championships. I'm not ready to be done yet. I refuse to retire. I'm not ready.
Yeah.
and
I think that's one of the things that allowed us to get along so well, is we both wanted to live that competitive lifestyle, with training being a high priority. And that's just kind of what we fell into, and it works real well.
another question, because this is one that was kind of coming up as I was going through all your guys' material, is how the hell do you find the time, for, the education, the training, and all those things? Because a lot of those were happening concurrently, right? And then there's glass blowing, which is in there.
Yep.
How do you manage all that? It's probably a little better now because the education part kind of, I don't want to say it's out because you're always learning, but it's at a different rate. You don't have to sit in a class, and, to be able to do that. But how did you manage all that?
A lot of it was prioritizing. Like an undergrad was fine. It wasn't that hard. So to be able to balance becoming an MMA fighter at that time, I was able to put a lot of emphasis on that, because my schoolwork, don't tell my undergrad professors, but I never read a book in undergrad. Like, it was not that hard for me. So school didn't take a huge chunk of time. It took some time, but I still had a lot of time where I could go to the gym, the weightlifting gym, and I could go to the karate school. And so I had a solid amount of time, and then working on top of that. So I was able to balance those. When I got into grad school got a little bit harder. So I still did I did one more MMA fight while I was in grad school during my master's degree. But when I started my PhD, things got really hard. And so I had to put more focus on school and less focus on jiu-jitsu. When I was doing my PhD, I maybe got to train jiu-jitsu once a week at best. Like when I was in the heart of data collection and writing, I had to prioritize school because I knew that I needed to get through school because I needed a good career. Because I had taken that semester off and done just jiu-jitsu and realized there's not a lot of money in this. So I knew I had to get my education because I wanted a successful career. So I prioritized that. And now what's kind of cool is my career has taken off. We're very secure at RP. And we're in a great spot in terms of our client base. And so I'm having a little more time that I can dedicate to jiu-jitsu, which is why over the past few years, I've been able to rack up these world titles because I have a nice steady client load that allows me to free up about 40 hours a week for more training. Whereas when RP was first starting out, we were building up the business. I didn't have time for that because I needed to focus so much emphasis on helping with getting the company going that I couldn't put all that much time into jiu-jitsu. And then the glass blowing is really good for when I'm injured and can't train at all. And it's also really good. Like when Derek was talking about the post-competition blues, that's when you'll really find me out in my studio because I can't train and I still have this time in my schedule that would have been dedicated to training. So I'll go out in the studio and be out there.
Yeah. I won't see her for the entire day when she's doing that. She's going to the studio. I just know like, oh, I'm living the bachelor life today. It's all me. But for me, my grad program was sports science oriented anyway. So Dr. Stone and Coach Meg Stone and everybody, all the professors and the rest of the student body was actually really supportive because I probably wouldn't have gone to grad school because I was already studying it on my own. I was already studying Dr. Stone's work before I went there. So just to try and be a better competitor. So a lot of the stuff I was already familiar with. I could pass some of the tests probably without even going through some of the courses. And that was the same deal with exercise science courses in undergrad that I used for prerequisites to get into the program to begin with. I was already studying those things and I had a really good grip on them because I wanted to know them. And that's a really big difference between people who get an education and live the life of a competitive athlete and learn those things because it directly affects them as a competitor. It's a whole different mindset. And I didn't just learn it to take a test later. I learned it to apply it to my entire life forever. And that helped a ton because I was able to not spend quite as much time studying. I still did a shitload of reading, but I was able to spend so much more time actually training. And people knew that that was a higher priority for me. And because of the standard of excellence in that program with working with Olympians, and Coach Meg Stone still holds the NCAA record for discus from 1976 to this day. So these people understood what it took to be at that level, and they were supportive, and they were always asking me about it. And if they needed me, I would be there. There were plenty of nights in grad school that I got almost no sleep. But I tried to prioritize times leading up to competition to where I would just basically say, look, guys, I need to not be here during this time frame. Don't schedule me for very much because I'm going to try to find somebody to cover one way or another. Because we had so much work to do in the lab with athlete monitoring and things like that. We'd have to be there 5, 6 in the morning. And, that's a real long day. Be at the school. And then I had a supervisor's position over strength and conditioning programs that we worked with outside of everything on campus at different universities. So I would travel around and do all that. And then I would get home at night and start working on my RP client load, start answering emails. And then it would be, midnight, 1 o'clock before I was able to go to sleep and go wake up at 4 or 5 in the morning again if we had athlete monitoring. But like she said, it's all about making priorities. So I was very communicative with everyone involved, and they were supportive back. And it's so important to have that kind of support system around to where you're giving what you're supposed to give in, but they give back all at the same time. And I absolutely loved my time in that program at East Tennessee State because of that. It was incredibly valuable. And just learning how they approach things as well. I interviewed so many of the coaches. Like, what are the main attributes that you've seen that are common in every single one of your really high-level successful athletes? And the answer always surprised me because almost all of them said some variation of, they were kind of selfish. But that's kind of what it took. You have to make yourself the priority depending on what level of success you want to have.
Mm-hmm. You both work from home.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Right. So how do you manage that? Because you're around each other all the time.
Yeah.
Except for when you train.
That's why I have a studio. Yeah. We are around each other a lot. Right now it's actually kind of harder because he bought 3 acres of land and we want to build a house. And we're going through that process. So right now we're in a tiny farmhouse that came with the land, and it's like 1,500 square feet. And we're there all day working together, training together, all of that. So when the new house gets built, it's going to have a second level, and that level is his. He can go up there and just, be gone. Because right now, unfortunately, his office is our living room, because that's the only space we have. So this poor guy doesn't get any privacy when he's trying to work. But before, when we were in Kansas, my Kansas house, we each had our own dedicated office, which is nice because it's like, okay, you go into your dedicated office, we're basically at work, and then we go into the communal space and now we're home from work. And so that was nice, but we just don't have that split right now because of the small house. But once we get the new house, having that split, the space designated, this is workspace, it kind of makes it like you went to work. We're separate at this time.
Yeah.
So.
All right. Well, I want to thank you guys for coming out.
Oh,
It's
thanks
been
so
a pleasure. Guys, check out their links in the bio, and we're done.
Awesome.
Hey guys, real quick, we realized that something ridiculous, like 80% of the people that watch the podcast don't subscribe. So subscribe to the channel and make sure to check out the description for more details on the guest, links to their pages, and give us a few days, but the show notes will be there. Or not the show notes, the timestamps. Hey, we're just rolling with this thing right now. If you've been following the Table Talk podcast, you know that element is a staple in most strength athlete and coaches' repertoire when working with the athletes or as they're preparing for whatever endeavor they're preparing for. I personally use it every day. My favorite flavor is the grapefruit, which I'll mix in water during my training, post-training, or basically throughout the whole day. I'll also use half a pack on my oatmeal in the morning. And if I don't put it in my oatmeal, then I'll put half a pack in my coffee. There's a variety of different chocolate flavors that come into the chocolate pack. I'm using it throughout the entire day. I'm not front loading it before my training. And I find that it completely eliminates the brain fog, which I just had, so maybe I should have had my element. Table Talk listeners can receive a free sample pack with any order. To go to www.drinkelement.com/tabletalk. That again is www.drinkelement.com/tabletalk. Element also offers a no questions asked refund policy. So if you don't like it for any reason, give it to a salty friend and they'll give you a complete 100% money back. Visit SleepMe/Table Talk to get your chili pad and save up to $315 with the code TableTalk. This offer is available exclusively for Table Talk listeners and only for a limited time. Order it today with free shipping and try it out for 30 days. You can return it for free if you don't like it with their sleep trial. Visit www.sleep.me/tabletalk. Because you're not investing in better sleep, you're creating a better life. www.sleep.me/tabletalk.